I'm Turi McKinley. I'm a Participatory Design Director at Frog. It's kind of an odd title. Participatory Design basically means that I'm one of the leads of our design research practice at Frog. And Frog is, if you don't know Frog, it's a global product design and strategy firm. But today I want to talk to you guys about some of the strategies that I've been seeing over about 10 years at Frog around how we make user experiences come to life, not for what the user sees, but for what the team that is taking them on and owning them within the company and making them come to life. I think one of the challenges that anybody here who's been in an agency probably remembers, if you're in-house now, is the sort of disappointment you have as a designer when a great idea that you've come up with and it's based in user needs and it's meaningful and it's exciting and it doesn't go anywhere. So you start asking yourself, why is that? And I think this is a great group to be talking to about this topic because all of us are here because we have been part of making some kind of great user experience, whether you're here as one of the people who's receiving an award or you're here because you've chosen to come and see what has been shared publicly. So, you know, when we think about the challenges that we encounter within organizations or that we see the clients that we're designing these products for encounter. I think the thing we want to think about is why. Why does that experience not sustain or survive over time? And it seems like they should, because user experience is much in demand with companies. You know, we're going to be hearing from Uber later, so I chose Uber here. But companies that have great experiences, they're much talked about, right? And it's known that great user experiences tends to lead towards success for companies. And companies, as they look at themselves, even if they aren't the Ubers of the world, right? They want to also be delivering this kind of experience. So they're looking in-house, they're looking at the kinds of experiences they deliver, they're auditing them, they're saying, what do we do well, what don't we do well? And they're very often beginning to hire teams in. They're building teams. They want to bring that skill set and that mindset in-house. And in essence, they're seeking not just great products, but they're seeking better answers to how they do what they do, how they build the experiences that people will be encountering. And I think one of the things that we continue to see is that you realize, I mean, all of us here as UX designers know that user experience isn't designed by one individual. It is something that is built across disciplines. It's a deeply multidisciplinary effort. And it's not a one-time thing, right? You know, you build it, you launch it, and you continue to own it over time. But to make that over time experience functional, to make the product continue to grow over time, often, for many companies, there's a mind shift that's needed. We need to look at the barriers that we have within the culture of our organization or the culture of our team and understand what's resisting us sustaining these great experiences. So I'll share with you guys a few of the ones that I've seen most often. How many folks here work in a big company? Really big company. Okay, so this one probably feels familiar to you. The sort of reality of silos in the organization. And I think one of the most painful when you come from a design research or a human-centered design perspective is when the sales team says, wait, you guys can't talk to customers. That's my relationship. That's my bottom line. You know, when you're not able to actually reach across the siloed walls to talk to the customers, or internally, when it's a stage gate process that doesn't let the design team work with the technology team until certain definitions have been set, right? When those persist, it becomes very hard to keep that user experience that you launched once, keep it robustly growing, because that technologist now is behind the stage gate wall, or you have to build a relationship with the sales team and actually go out and continue to have contact with your customers. And obviously there's ways to address this, but just that mindset within the team can be very challenging to overcome. And then sometimes the problems we encounter are as simple or as complex as language. This is an example that I see a lot in an agency at Frog, where our client comes and they say, hey, I want you to prototype. You know, I know that iterative design and building prototypes is a great thing to do. It's a great way to get ongoing feedback. And we agree with our customers. But then when we're trying to scope out the work, our technology team says, wait a second, a prototype, that means one thing and one level of effort. I think we should call it a simulation. And then we kind of go back and forth, and it's like, no, maybe that should be a prototype or a proof of concept. And we often, kind of have this back and forth about the language. So that's just the scoping of a project in an agency, but I see the same things when I look at my client teams, that often once a product has been built, a language can be established where the teams think they're talking about the same thing, but over time they diverge. It can be painful, right? I see some nodding heads. So these are barriers that can be addressed and can be overcome by a range of different processes. But sometimes the challenges that a group has really aren't problems, they're just realities. And those realities can be about the different working styles of two different team members or two different disciplines, or being an introvert and an extrovert, the different ways they solve problems, and of course recognizing that both of those members, those ways of working are valuable. Sorry. So when we look at these and the other kinds of realities that you encounter in your own teams, right? Those shape your experience of shaping the user experience. They become either supports or they undermine your ability to continually develop and evolve a user experience. Okay, so my background is cultural anthropology, so I use that term a lot. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean. I'd like you guys to look around the room and identify the people that you would say are in your own tribe. You see anybody here that's in your own tribe? So, so what is it that, I want you to ask yourself, what was it that made you select them? Why are they in your tribe? Was it the way they dress? Was it the fact that you went to grad school together, or that you know who they dated last year? Was it the way they talked when they came in? What are the sort of subtle signals that tell you that this person is in your tribe? So for me at Frog, when I think of Frog, the social connections and the fabric that make Frog the place that I work, that makes me identify with my team, some of the things for me are the shared traditions that we have, like Fancy Fridays, to the fact that every time I'm scoping out a new global research program, I can reach out to the design research practice, and we have this great back and forth about designing the study. So it's traditions, it can be the sense of humor and the sort of the soft characteristics of your team. But this is also the Build It group in the New York studio, which is willing to, at the drop of a hat, stay all night and make anything. So it's also that desire to do that's part of the culture that makes my team work effectively for me. But in general, it's a willingness to work together and a desire to get to know the different types of needs and characters of people within your team. and the tools that support it. So this is an example of our team leaps, where at the beginning of a program, we sit down and we talk about how do you like to work? Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Half and half. What are the ways in which what are the things that you need? How do you think? What do you need? What time do you need to leave the office? So when I think of the culture of a team, and I'm looking at my team or I'm looking at the culture of the teams that I'm working with for my clients, I'm often asking myself, what are the joint beliefs, those kind of subtle signals, and that build that sense of belonging to the team? What is it that makes me willing to go outside the stage gate process and talk to somebody on the technology team if I'm in one of these big companies? Or how do I build that trust with the sales team that says, hey, I can go out and I can talk to the customer and you know that I won't damage that relationship? In essence, that question is, what's the culture of your team? So I would say that there are, I'd like you to think about it, and as you think of the culture of your own teams, I suspect that you can bucket them into sort of 4 key categories. The first are the values. What does your team value? Does your team value, healthy life and a good balance? Or the first image I had in here was a graffiti of a businessman with sort of a razor blade for the business case. Is it competition? What does your team value? What are the goals? These can be the organizational goals, of course, but they're also the goals of the team themselves. And what do people want to achieve as they're working together? And then what are the assumptions? What do you believe about your users? What do you believe about the technology team or about the sales team or about the design team? And of course, what are the processes, both explicit and implicit, that exist? So if you think about your organization and the culture of your team, you can probably begin to bucket things this way. What I see when I go into a lot of my clients is we're being asked not just to design a product. We're being asked to design a product and a user experience that can survive all of these. So I think many people here who've been in an organization have experienced when a big new goal comes in, new executive comes in, we've got a new vision for the company, we're going to change things, it's all going to be different. But let's say you come in and the new vision for the company is user-centered design. We're going to be spending time with our consumers. If the assumptions about what customer contact means don't change, or the processes don't change that support it, that big idea, that big goal will probably never become core to the value of the company or the team. So building trust, changing assumptions, those are things which happen over time. So at Frog, as a company that is often asked to do big visions, we're often asked to come in and help the company set a new vision. But what we realize is that we don't succeed unless we're able to have impact kind of across that reality of team culture. So in my time at Frog, I've seen kind of a fundamental shift in what I'm being asked to do as a designer and researcher. When I started, my title was design analyst at the time. It was to design a product that's going to impact customer behavior or user behavior, depending on, B2B or B2C. But it was very much focused on jumping over the team that would own the product after we left and designing for the end goal. And what I think we're being asked to do now is, yes, still design that product, still change customer behavior, but also help our teams be able to take on this vision that we've created and make it their own. So it's kind of an odd place to be as a designer, right? It changes what it means to develop a product.
So for Frog, we've kind of looked back at about 40 years of our history and thought about what are some of the tools that we use that are effective at trying to bridge those gaps or those needs within teams. And we've created a bit of a structure to put those tools together, and we've built out a bit of a toolkit, the Frog Think Toolkit, to gather those together in a way that can be shared. So what I would like to do today is share some of those tools that help align multidisciplinary teams. And how am I doing on time? I think I'm okay. All right, so the first tool, it's probably not going to be a big surprise to anybody here. It's about being intentional. The power of reflection and asking yourself, who do we want to be? Why do we want to be here? Is really kind of incredible when you've got a team trying to work together over time. So whether it's that team leap that I referred to earlier, or it's a process of regular reflection. Some teams do it at the bar, go out to the bar and talk about, has the user research shifted the goal or the mission of the product that we're creating? But being intentional about asking those questions is really key to having a successful team that's able to own a vision, keep their language aligned, overcome the silos, and build that kind of trust that we were talking about earlier. One of the examples I gave as a barrier was the introvert and the extrovert, right? I think it's critical to get teams together, to sit down around a table, to generate ideas together, but it's also important to have that shared space across your disciplines be structured so that you are not wasting anybody's time, but you're getting your teams together and they're able to get out of their comfort zone in a structured set of time. The other, stimulate creativity. So mix talents up, get different skills together, get different levels of seniority together, and push them outside of their comfort zone. Here we've got some aid workers and physicians and some innovators and product designers together trying to understand how you would diagnose if a child is having enough trouble breathing that you would say it's pneumonia. And it's important that it's not just the creatives that are brought together, that it's the whole product team. And of course, we're a company that makes things. It's really important for teams to get together and literally build out those shared experiences and capture the common understandings about language, about process, about assumptions, about the product that you're designing itself. So these kind of processes and tools are things we've used with a lot of clients. I'll share with you two examples. They're both in the healthcare space, but they come from very different sides. The photos that we just looked at were from a set of workshops with UNICEF, where they were trying to bring together aid agencies, donors, researchers, people who had field experience, end users, suppliers, together to figure out how can we, it's a very high goal, right? How can we end pneumonia, childhood deaths due to pneumonia by 2025? It's an area, if you've anybody worked in this kind of international development, it's very hard to get researchers to talk together with the suppliers, with the end users. We had, at the beginning of this workshop, we had people coming in with ideas of, okay, we're going to put the iPhone on the chest of the child, and as the child breathes, we're going to be using the cloud to do diagnostics of their respiratory rate, and so that will overcome the problem that most of the aid workers are illiterate and illiterate, right? Certain on-the-ground realities about connectivity and the likelihood that the iPhone is actually going to be out in this context didn't really matter to the researcher. So that's one example of of the kind of challenges to sustainable alignment among this team. So we went through a series of activities, which you saw some of the photos of, from that FrogThink toolkit with UNICEF to develop a framework for evaluating products for pneumonia. And that is continuing to be a framework that they're returning to, and they're continuing to do these kind of workshops among their teams. On the total other side of the healthcare spectrum, we worked with a health insurance company in one of the states. And they had a new leader who'd come in, and he said, okay, I've got a new vision for our company, I've got a new name, and hey, we've just bought the ground floor of this building. I want you to go in and make an innovation center that reflects the new vision. Well, the new vision hadn't been set. It hadn't even really been announced, and there was really no idea of innovation center. What does that mean? So we worked with them for a couple months and took them through a process of working with their internal teams, and they had a lot of static internal structures. And as a company, they had lots of different executives come in with lots of different big visions, and there was a belief that nothing is really going to change. So we spent time with them to look at what an innovation center might be, to understand their organization and develop the design for this center. In the end, it wasn't a physical design, it was a design of the experience of being part of an innovation center in this building, in this location. And the end result has been that vision that we created for them is moving forward, and that's great, but they have taken the kinds of activities that we did with them to arrive at that vision, and they're using that to create the structure that people participating in the Innovation Center will go through. So they're seeing that as both a way for them to bring people into their new Innovation Center, but also do employee rotations and create kind of a new mindset within their company as a whole. So how do we then build user experiences that can succeed over time? What I'm seeing is that it's not only about designing the product, it really is about designing the team and building that, thinking about how we make that experience work together. And it's deeper than just the pieces of the experience that the users touch. So, thank you. Do you guys have any questions? All right, I will turn this. Sure. So I think very often when we're asked to design a product, we're asked to build something that will be desirable, be meaningful, be engaging to customers, and it will become part of their lifestyle, right? That's ultimately about changing their behavior. That's about integrating with who they are, right? So I think when I think of the process of design, it's about understanding the meaning and the impact of that product. So. And I think that's what most of us do as designers. But the other challenge is, how do we make that sustainable?
I have a question about the team.
Yeah.
So ideally, is that part should like have different people, they have the skill set and interaction?
Absolutely. I think any user experience team needs to have it needs to be a multidisciplinary, multifaceted team. In part because building products today is not a single facet experience, but also because organizations themselves are complex, and we need to be able to build our web and sustain our vision throughout the organization.
So should they have a shared
I think so. That would be great if we could say there's one thing. I think fundamentally it's a willingness to work together. And I think a lot of the tools and processes that I was trying to talk to are about encouraging that willingness to work together and supporting the intention of working together. Yeah. All right.
I think that's got it. Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. I should say the reason we're starting late is we thought that the format was a little long, so we figured that you guys would appreciate some time, extra time to drink a little bit more. I guess I'll start off by just asking each of you to introduce yourselves. Margaret, you want to go first? Yeah, maybe turn it brighter. Yeah. Sorry, it's really hard to see up here.
Awesome. Okay, I'm Margaret Stewart, and I'm Director of Product Design at Facebook.
I'm Brian Kralovich, VP of Design, Digital Design Products at Amazon.
So I'm Cliff Kwong. I'm an editor at Wired. I oversee the design coverage there and was previously at Fast Company. As Margaret and Brian sort of alluded to, they have pretty big jobs overseeing, I think, design organizations, UX organizations that are probably bigger than most, probably 95% of the world's design organizations. So the first question I wanted to ask, since both these guys deal with design at a very large scale, is how their jobs have changed in the course of them. Margaret, I know that you were previously at YouTube and Google. Brian, you've done years at Microsoft and Xbox and design agencies at some point. So I'm wondering if you guys could just maybe talk about how, in the arc of your career, the scope of what you've been doing has changed.
Well, I always joke that I've become completely emotionally detached from my title because over the years, my whole profession seems to rename itself like every 4 to 5 years. I started as a web designer and then user experience, now it's product design, and I kind of just realized that if I'm working on an interesting product with good people, I kind of don't care what my title is, which is actually a good place to be. I feel like we're in a nightclub. Boom, 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 boom. And I think probably the most important thing that has evolved, because, let's be clear, the disciplines that are represented in this room are kind of being invented as we go along. And I think having creative confidence about what we're doing is the thing that has changed the most. I think early on, it's like, nobody knew how to design for the web, and then nobody knew how to design for phones. And, with each challenge that's thrown at this design community, we develop a sense of best practices, and we share that, I think pretty well as an industry and a community. And then, we gain that confidence to jump into whatever the next challenge is. So I think it's that confidence that you see in industrial design and graphic design, these design disciplines that have decades and decades of heritage to draw on. We're kind of in our infancy, but I feel like we're getting to a point where, we can say with a reasonable amount of certainty, like, that's really good work. And I think that was harder, 5-10 years ago. Because I think everything's in flux, right? And every experience feels like it's new to everyone who's using it. And so, how do you separate, change a version from bad hardware, from bad software? And I feel like as the baseline rises for all the things that are required to make great digital product experiences, we really start to get a sense of what we think is good.
So I sort of grew up in the design industry in the city back in the mid-90s. That's how old I am, and I had hair at the time. But from the mid-90s, probably to 2003, I was working in boutique studios that were probably 15 to 40 on up to about 90 people. And one of the primary disciplines, or at least principles, that we carry through while we're growing those studios is maintaining sort of core creative DNA. And how you do that was a challenge back then, because I didn't know how to scale. When you're trying to really maintain the core DNA of a boutique studio, when you're taking on bigger and bigger jobs, when you're partnering with Microsoft or the Googles of the world. As I switched over to the client side, whether it was Microsoft on Xbox or Nokia on phones, and now at Amazon, one thing I've always tried to do, whether the teams are 50 or they're a couple hundred, is maintain studio culture and creative DNA. And the way I've done that is just focus on the model. Even though my job titles have changed, and I've been waiting for that VP title all my life, I really am creative director at heart, and I actually want to be a creative director more than a VP now, because I miss the creative interaction and making things daily. But what I've done is create a studio, whether it's 100 or 200, where we have small teams of 12 to 15 people that are always led by creative directors, really strong producers, that all have different types of disciplines peppered on them. You could rip apart one of those teams, give them $500,000, well, nowadays $1 million, to go start a business, and they can be very successful. And that model and that structure, that's sort of what I spend my time on, is focusing on how to protect creativity in the giant enterprise companies. And that sometimes works really well, and sometimes takes a really long time. It doesn't work very well. But it usually takes about 2 to 3 years to kind of build the DNA and the core sort of structure within a company to make sure that the products start to reflect that creativity. PM partners, dev partners don't really quite get centralized design, but they start to see the value after about 18 to 24 months.
So Brian, are the teams that you use to work on product, are they still very small? I mean, do you like...
Extremely small. So we basically will not let a team get larger than 20 on any particular product. So for instance, our Kindle Fire team is 8 people. Core, they have interaction design, visual motion, but then we pepper design technology in there, producer, and then 1 researcher, and that's really the team. Anything more than that, we're going to lose control. It just becomes a management nightmare. And if you could pull that off in a big corporation, you get better products for it, and there's more accountability. There's more sense of urgency.
Morgan, I'm wondering if you could actually tell the audience a little bit about what you do. You know, Brian has sort of talked a little bit about that, but I was hoping that you could sort of tell them.
In terms of the products that I'm working on?
Yes,
or
exactly.
Yeah, so I've actually spent my whole career in the consumer space, you know, designing, you know, Google search and then YouTube, and then when I moved to Facebook, I did a pretty big change because what I took on was the job of building a team to do all of the business and enterprise software. So, you know, the Pages product, which is building you know, business and organizational presence, and then all of the advertising tools, which is like a really new space for Facebook. I mean, it's a pretty young company to begin with, definitely very consumer-oriented in its design principles, its approach to design, and even the kinds of designers historically that the company has hired. And so a lot of my job over the past 2.5 years is building a sense of what is a quality business product. How does that differ, if at all, from what good consumer products are? And what is the ideal kind of team that can consistently excel at doing that kind of work? And that's actually been a really interesting experience for me. I mean, I really like learning about new stuff. Advertising is not the easiest domain space. I mean, how many people here work anywhere near or inside the advertising industry? Anyone? Yeah, like it's definitely a humbling industry to try to get your head around, and you can't always approach it, you know, just with design intuition. You really need to kind of spend time understanding the people for whom you're designing, and so that's really my job, is creating the team, but also the design principles and the culture around what it means to build great enterprise software. Some of the folks that are in this room actually have a lot more experience in that than I do and than Facebook does. But we're also like pretty excited because I think probably a lot of people in this room agree that we're at the point where we don't want a quality difference between enterprise and consumer. Like, we should have amazing enterprise software. It's actually really upsetting to me that, you know, historically I think there's been such a low bar and people thinking, oh, well, you know, these people don't choose the tools, so we don't actually have to make them that great because they can't opt out of using this expense system or this, you know, travel booking system. And so, you know, the pressure isn't there. They don't have the opportunity to cut bait and choose another product. And so I think that like that kind of naturally has created this lack of motivation. And so I think internally we're just denying that reality. And we're always telling ourselves, well, what if somebody could just choose a different ad serving tool? Like, we know they can't, but what if they could? What would be the bar for excellent experience that we'd hold ourselves to so that they're like, you know, they couldn't just cut bait and choose something else?
So, actually, I'm wondering for both of you, how you sort of integrate research into both of these things. Because Brian, you're talking about integrating research into a really small team. very focused. Margaret, you're talking about integrating research into a team that comes to some of these problems probably pretty naively, maybe, with not a lot of ton of enterprise experience and whatnot. So, I mean, you know, you guys have both created these design agencies. I'm wondering how you work research in.
So the example I gave where I have teams of maybe 8 to 12, sometimes 15, we might have one researcher scaling across 2 products. And the word research for us currently is really more about usability midstream and maybe during the end of the product life cycle, but we are fixing that in such a way that we want to add the capability to have more research up front. Amazon is a very data-centric company. I don't work on the retail side of it, so I'm not very, my acumen is not around data. My acumen is around visual emotion and brand DNA. So there is more of that on the side of my world, which is the digital products world. So research is actually played down. We trust our gut. As Jeff says, we actually let us make smart decisions for our customers, and then let's measure that later. So research is not a critical part of the work that we do currently, and we're probably not going to lean into that in the future.
I guess the consumer space is a little bit easier if you're building those types of products to sort of imagine yourself.
Right, because I think all of us are the end user anyway. It's easy to say that, but there are situations where you're innovating on new product and new experiences, and you got to get it out there and start testing. So we're really bootstrapped, really grassroots when it comes to research, but we do use it just sparingly.
Margaret, I'm wondering, I know that you've been a big proponent of research in various
Yeah, I mean, I think research has a bunch of different faces. In the space that I'm working in, primarily, you know, there's a very robust product marketing team that does a lot of the analysis of market potential. It's more traditional market research. We have, not surprisingly, a really large analyst team that does data analytics around the current usage of the product and, you know, understanding if there's a problem that we're seeing in usage or revenue or whatever, like how do you get into the logs and figure out what's going on. And then we have, obviously, user research team that does both qualitative and quantitative. And I think, you know, for us in the ad space in particular, you know, everybody knows that they need to work with research because nobody there thinks they can intuitively understand what it means to be a Fortune 500 CMO or even a full-time worker at an ad agency. So it's a pretty easy sell to say, oh, go watch this, you know, usability session, or go on this field visit and watch this person working and their 3 monitors and how they use Excel and like all these crazy like workarounds that people create for their workflows. And the other thing that I think we've done that's been pretty interesting is we created and staffed, there's like maybe 5 or 6 people who lead a team called the Empathy and Customer Immersion program, where, you know, it's actually a pretty big challenge, especially for a company that is growing as fast as Facebook. We're hiring lots of people, but, you know, we hire on like talent and potential and not necessarily because you have a ton of ads experience. We believe that like smart, motivated people can like learn about a domain space, but it isn't an easy space to learn about. And so we created this team that has whole programs around getting people ramped up in a tough domain space. So, you know, we run a 2-week ads camp, which is like intense courses around all of the different aspects of the industry. And then we fly new people or even people who need a refresher to visit our call centers, and they spend a couple of days listening in on calls and hearing firsthand what the pain points are. You know, we do site visits for agencies and observe people working. And so it's a responsibility that we've taken really seriously because, you know, there's nothing more upsetting than somebody who's really smart and talented feeling deflated because they don't have the confidence to like be bold in their creative decision making. And it's kind of our duty to try to get them feeling that confident as quickly as possible. And it doesn't happen in the same way that it does in a traditional consumer space where, you know, most people who come to the company have been using Facebook as people for a long time. And so they can approach the photos product or the messenger product with a certain amount of I kind of understand this space. And I just think in an enterprise space, obviously, there's a higher bar to help people along that educational path.
One thing I noticed when you guys were both talking, you've talked about being sort of designers in the past with your hands on whatever you're designing. And now you guys are both talking about sort of more managerial things and sort of overseeing creative process and keeping it going. And so I'm wondering, as you've made that transition.
Whoever just did that.
That's great. Thank you. Where do you guys take the most satisfaction now that you've sort of moved away from the hands-on thing and have moved into the role of managing the creative process?
Well, I can speak mostly from the perspective of design, which is more my background. When I talk to folks who are trying to figure out their career path, and it's like, oh, do I want to become like a more senior designer and like lead work, or do I want to be a people manager? And I said, listen, people generally speaking fall into two camps. There are people who see a bunch of awesome people and then they're like, ooh, they're doing really cool work. And then there are people who say, wow, there's this really cool work, and ooh, look, there's people doing it. And so it's like, you got to figure out, is your orientation like initially and immediately towards the work or the people? And they're both really, really important. And generally speaking, my orientation is around the people. So I am actually really excited and happy when the people on my team are doing great work and I haven't had a ton hands-on to do with it, because I feel like my job as a manager of a pretty large team is to create the conditions for other people to do great work. And like, for instance, I'm deeply involved in establishing our design principles. That's like where I get involved in the work, but it's really more about frameworks as opposed to getting hands-on. And I think when you're building a team at scale, that's kind of the reality. Like it gets pretty complicated when you want to be in the trenches and you're managing 75 people. But for me, that's like been a fine trade-off because it's the part of the job that I enjoy the
Can you
most.
actually talk a little bit about the design principles and then
Yeah.
ask Brian the same question?
So, again, I think it gets back to kind of enterprise software and designing tools for work instead of pleasure that's, relatively new to the company, and helping even the rest of the design community at Facebook understand, when we're doing presentations at our team meetings, this is why our stuff looks different than your stuff. Like in consumer, it's all about radical simplification. Remove everything. Like anybody who's worked on ads interfaces knows if you're working on a targeting interface and you radically simplify it, it actually doesn't work anymore. Like there is like a minimum amount of functionality that you need for that technology to work. And so there's different principles, and the way that I often explain it is in thinking about not what do people think about the product they're using, but how do you want them to think about themselves while they're using it? And when I think about the Facebook product that many of us and many people around the world use, you might think of things like we want people to feel connected or validated or loved. And then in the enterprise space, we want them to feel efficient and confident and powerful. Very, very different adjectives. And the principles that fall out of that, like predictability and efficiency and reliability, or clarifying complexity, not getting rid of complexity, but clarifying it, are very, very different. So when you say, is this thing ready to ship? Like there's a different set of guidelines that you're going to use to measure whether or not it's ready to ship, and then afterwards whether it's successful.
Interesting. So just for you guys, just to reiterate the question before, I was just curious about what you take satisfaction in now that you sort of move up into this higher level of abstraction of the design process.
Thanks for restating it. We have a principle at Amazon, and I actually use it throughout the studio where we dive deep. And sometimes that could be sort of misunderstood as getting in the way. But diving deep is probably the area that I get most satisfaction. I'm still allowed to be a creative person, which is really great. And my team's allowed me to play in that space. Shipping product for me is really exciting. So being part of sort of day one where we're conceptualizing projects, and 2 years later sometimes 6 months later, shipping a product is very exciting. I mean, I got excited about building buildings when I was an architect. When I was in boutique studios, I didn't have that fulfillment because you hand it over to said client and you go, good luck with that, and then you usually don't build half of it. So making sure from cradle, not to grave, but from cradle to ship that it's built that way, that's where I get most of my satisfaction. And we built a culture around that. So I'm allowed to have desk crits. I'm allowed to have, Wednesday we shut down the studio. You don't go to meetings. We actually have all-day reviews of the products that we create. And I'm allowed to participate in that. I set it up, hopefully I'm allowed to do it. But the teams allow that interaction, so that's really satisfying for me.
But so how do you, in a previous life, I used to work in a consulting firm, and we used to call the partners seagulls because they would just fly in and shit over everything.
Yeah, so did we.
So how do you prevent that from happening if that's going to be the case?
You have to be along on the journey. You have to be self-aware. You can't just fly and say, where are we on this project? How come we haven't done this? That's your example. If you are actually part of the original idea and you're checking in along the way, it's a lot of work to do 6 to 7 products and be participating in this. I might not scale for 7, but I scale for 5. So you have to be part of the journey. That's why every Wednesdays we have these meetings. And I don't miss them. You know, I have so many other meetings where I'm managing up. Those are the one meetings I take very seriously. And the studio, 100+ people, like they look forward to that opportunity. Otherwise, it will be me checking in every 3 months saying, why are we doing this? Why are we doing 3D? You know, those sort of things. So it's something I have to do, and I have to work to make sure it happens. Unless everybody's lying to me, like they feel very fulfilled in that interaction. So.
Next question, going the other direction. We talked about you guys moving sort of up the food chain. I'm wondering how you guys manage up the food chain. You know, you guys deal with very charismatic, big personalities that lead your organizations, and I'm wondering how you explain the process, how you think about communicating what you guys do upwards to the management of that you guys interact with. Anybody want to go first? Brian?
So in my career, I think some people in the room who have worked with me, whether it was Bill Gates or Ballmer or now Jeff, they're just different personalities. And I got schooled along the way about the way those individuals like to be perceived and the way they want to review work. Most of the time they don't have a clue what the hell you're talking about. But Jeff, for example, will go as deep as you let him go with you on a journey. So if you want to present the design idea with him, he's going to go all the way down to the icon if you allow him. If you don't want him, you could actually steer him away from that conversation. I spend a lot of my time, though, focused on work. We're very tactical, sometimes a little bit too practical, but we're focused on the work. So we don't do a lot of process discussions. We don't try to justify the organization. We don't talk about the way the group is structured. They just let me run with that, and we just talk about the work. And it's a very building culture in Amazon. That was much different than it was at Microsoft. Microsoft, being a design there, if there's people from Microsoft here who know me, it's every once in a while you'll find your little oxygen hole under the ice. And you poke through and you kind of, here's what we need to do, and then the ice closes up on you a little bit. At Amazon, there's none of that. And one thing I've been preaching is that user experience is owned by the company. My PM, the development partners, my business partners, my marketing partners are all user experience folks. And what I'm trying to do at Amazon is get back to design and craft and really knowing how to make things beautiful. And people look at you like you're crazy. But you know, we hired interaction designers with strong capabilities in all other disciplines too. And you'll find that we have great generalists on staff. We have 7 previous architects on my team. Because the education for architecture suits like interaction design. It's rigorous, they get the speed and the pace, and they wear many hats. Anyway, I'm rambling, but that's key to what we do.
So you actually, can you just expand on it a little bit about, you were saying letting everybody be a user experience person. I mean, that's easy to say. I mean, I would think that was hard to do. Can you just explain?
Well, I don't allow it. It's happening to me.
Okay.
So once something like that happens to you, don't fight it. Just remember what you can do with your hands that they can't do, and know what they can do with their hands. and embrace that. So my teams really work on the things they've been doing in agencies or other companies or at school, which is the making portion of it. Not trying to over post-it note it, not trying to over wireframe it, all the things we know we have to do on a day-to-day basis. But all that stuff on the board, all the whiteboarding, that's an inclusion process. Everybody gets to participate in that. The actual making and the craft of expressing those ideas, all of a sudden the room just stops because they don't know what to do, and that's where we step in as designers. So that's kind of, it's not something I'm saying, hey, by the way, you guys are user experience people too. It's just happening to me. Like we created producers at Xbox, and now there's UX PMs throughout Microsoft. I think that's kind of cool, actually. They're not just PMs, they're user experience PMs. They are writing user experience scenarios left and right, whether they're good, bad, or ugly.
So Margaret, back to the original question about sort of managing upwards, like how do you sort of communicate and think about that design process, putting it in front of sort of a leader of an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty lucky in that the leaders at Facebook, Mark has incredible design instincts. And he has very, very close working relationships with designers. It's a pretty easy thing to kind of engage in design conversations. I think wherever you are, as Brian was saying, you kind of have to manage the presentation and the scope of the presentation to have the kind of conversation that you want to have. But I think it's really about kind of putting yourself in a culture that I think there's two things: that respects the role of people who've been trained or who've developed the skills to do a particular part of this whole like crazy magic that we're all trying to do, and then recognizing, and it's I guess I don't think of it as like something that's happening to me that other people are doing user experience, because I feel like I've been in these cultures that have really strong, vibrant, talented engineering organizations, and I really come to empathize with how offensive it can be to an engineer to have somebody say I'm in charge of user experience. Like, I think the number one thing ultimately that people care about is performance. It does not matter how well the UI is designed if it doesn't load. And so to tell a perf engineer that they are not intimately related to user experience is pretty arrogant, actually. So titles notwithstanding, I think having engineers deeply involved in the conversation of what kind of experience do you want to create for this population of people is incredibly important. And to really see yourself as a designer saying, okay, I have these special skills and I can use them to promote the ideas that I have, but I also have a responsibility to help these other folks visualize their ideas too. Because guess what? Sometimes their ideas are going to be better than mine. And they may not have the skills to mock it up or bring it to life, and maybe I can collaborate to prototype it with them. Maybe they can help me build a prototype that brings an idea to life. And so it's that collaboration between design and engineering that I think consistently creates great work. It just doesn't, in my experience, happen when the disciplines are siloed.
So I was just going to change tack a little bit and just ask you each, what are the problems that keeps each of you up at night? I mean, what are the sort of big macro things that you worry about in the sort of tenure in your job and the organizations you sit upon?
I mean, my number one focus is on growing the team with the right people. I think when you're building a team, hiring the right people is the most important thing. Everything else is downstream. Everything you're trying to do for the next 5 to 10 years hinges on you making the right hiring decisions today. And so becoming the best recruiter and interviewer and continuing to hone those skills.
How do you do that?
It's,
I will say,
yeah.
There's been studies that interviews are almost sort of they're not correlated with job performance, for example.
Totally. It's funny. I do feel like over the years I've developed the spidey sense within like 5 to 10 minutes of somebody walking in and presenting, where I'm like, yeah or no. Like, it is terrible. But I actually find that it's definitely more right than it is wrong, and I can't even necessarily pinpoint what it is that makes a candidate feel promising versus not. I think that it's also about recognizing what it means to create an interviewing process that brings out like the potential in people, where you don't design it to look for faults, but you design it to look for strengths. And in a conversation where you're trying to decide about what to do with a candidate, that you can always find a reason to reject somebody. Always, always, always. I didn't like their shoes, they, said too much, I mean, like, whatever the pet peeve is of like one of the people in the interviewing panel. But like, if you can skew the conversation towards what could this person bring, and like, will they up our game at some level, you're getting to the point where you're managing to strengths instead of focusing too much on weakness. Which can be hard, because if you have a lot of candidates that you're going through, you're kind of looking for reasons to like weed it out. I mean, I tend to be a really optimistic person, so I also like to pair myself with people who are like super tough interviewers. So you get that balance of like, I'm always looking for potential, and then this person is just like the worst critic of portfolios, and just to balance it out and be thoughtful about that. But ultimately, like, you're also just looking to create a good candidate experience. Even if that person doesn't make the cut, you want them to leave thinking, hey, I didn't get that job, but that was a great experience. Because, this industry is really small. And if you treat people poorly, and you don't communicate with them, and you don't take that candidate experience well end to end, you will pay for it in the long run.
Brian, did you want to respond to that, or go to the original question about what keeps you up at night, either or?
What keeps me up at night?
Okay.
The first thing is really the responsibility of trying to stitch it all together. When you are working in a large company and there's a million products being launched, sometimes you're not even aware of them. They just happen to you. And it's trying to stitch that together and just feeling the need as a designer to make it all make sense to the consumer, whether it's from a brand perspective or just real practical or tactical things from a controls and UI's perspective. It's hard to kind of keep up with that. And it might not sound like a big deal, but it keeps me up at night, because you own a few products here, there's another 12 products over there, and if you don't get it right, you're going to Frankenstein the hell out of those things. And Amazon, I mean, we built a great design team over the last 2 years, but nobody knows who the hell we are, and we're trying to build that cadence and raise the bar for design while trying to keep it together. And my CEO is shipping products faster than I can keep up with him. That keeps me up at night. But I agree with you on also employee retention. As we're building great teams, you have to get your design street cred built very quickly to keep those employees. Not a day goes by where I lose a candidate to a better startup offer that has snowboarding and massages. It drives me absolutely crazy. I mean, it's a different industry than I grew up in, making 18 grand a year. So it's just, it drives me crazy, the amount of recruiting and offers and carrots that are out there. I don't even know how Google or Apple even are able to do it.
You can say Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook too. Yeah.
We don't have snowboarding.
You guys have, I won't even go there. But I have friends in all these places and I hear about these offers, and it's hard to compete with. And of course, I know I'm in Seattle, but we do have presence here in the Bay Area. So I have a little bit more insight to those situations.
Can you actually explain a little bit more about, so you worry about keeping everything coherent, keeping everything feeling like it's unified and has some sort of identity that goes beyond just the visual appeal of it. Have you found any good strategies for that? Thinking about that?
Sure. So we're working on one. It took me about a year to kind of get my management and Jeff just to believe in a centralized design mentality. That doesn't mean that we work as centralized daily. We're very decentralized, which allows more innovation, which allows the pace of creativity and for us to get shipping out the door. But we actually have built a design center at Amazon. We're actually co-located in one space, and we're building one here in San Francisco. So we're starting to get to a point where we can actually talk left and right to designers working on other things. So really, very tactical approach of just making sure we're aligned on things. but we're actually starting to put together red threads, different features and different brand experiences that start to tie our products together, and working with marketing and engineer to make sure that other teams are being built the same way. So even though I might have a centralized team in another building, there might be 5 other development teams working on things very isolated. And they're all very creative, and they're all very great at their jobs, but they are very heads down because they need to be. And when they pop up, sometimes the left and right hand haven't talked to each other, and the customer feels the pain of those experiences. It's hard to unravel those things when you go out the door. So.
Wait, you said red threads. I've never heard that idea before. I mean, I think it makes sense, but can you explain that?
I picked it up from my boutique days. It's very much a marketing or brand idea, whereas there might be 3 red threads, whether it's social, whether it's personalization, I'm using just random ones, that tie 5 different products together. Whether it's an Xbox television, or Xbox on the phone, or Xbox expressed on a tablet. The music playback experience has to be exactly the same way, but also take advantage of the device that's in your hand. So those red threads they follow you from concept, through development, all the way through shipping and bug testing. Because if you make a change, wait a minute, we're off track. And that's how you actually make sure the experiences are all dialed. It's just something red threads. There's all kinds of different principles and slang for that.
So we've got just a couple minutes left. I'm just wondering if any of you guys have any questions for one here. You got one right here and then one right here.
Yeah, in the Facebook context, what was it like from a team and culture perspective when Hot Studio all of a sudden landed on the doorstep, highly capable to augment, but what did that do to the organization?
Yeah. So just in case you guys couldn't hear, asking about, we acquired Hot Studio, an agency, last year, and I actually drove that acquisition, and they came into my team. So they had been working on site for I think 12 people full-time on site, 4 days a week for a few months. And so it was an interesting process. I think we had established, and part of the reason that we decided and brokered the deal was that culturally it felt like a great fit. Like most of the people who were working from Hot Studio on site, the cross-functional teams thought that they were just full-time employees. There wasn't this. We tried hard not to set up this, these are consultants and have an arm's length. They were on site, eating lunch and doing their thing just like any other designer. And I think the logistics of doing an acquisition that large were pretty challenging. Actually, I was mentioning the Ads Camp before. Ads Camp was created because of Hot Studio. Because I said to the team, I was like, listen, we've got a lot of really smart designers coming in, but none of them have ads experience. Do we really want them to wallow in fear of not knowing what's going on for 6 months? Let's see if we can set up a robust training program. And then it was so successful that we're like, oh, let's send all the engineers and PMs through this same program, and all the designers and all the researchers. So it was interesting. We learned a lot from that acquisition about how just to onboard people more effectively. I think some of the other things that I think came of it, I wish Maria were here, who's the CEO, because she could obviously speak to this as well, but agencies tend to be pretty specialized in terms of roles, and Facebook very purposefully is very generic about roles. All designers are called product designers. There are some people who are what we might refer to as UX designers or visual designers, and we've kind of made a decision, at least at this point in time, who knows how it will change, that we would rather not put people in a box and see what they do when they are just put in a general category, and to recognize again that some people have certain strengths and other people will be super strong across the board. And so I think that was a transition for people coming in where they used to have a very specific role, and then it's no, actually, get out of the nest. You can actually do a lot of this, or maybe let's get you to the point where you can do a lot of this. Or for some people, oh, we'll pair you because you're adding a ton of value in this particular way. So I think that moving from the specialist to the more general title was a transition. Our organization is super flat. We have a job ladder that has 8 levels and nobody knows what level anyone else is. You could have 6 weeks of experience and 16 years of experience and you have the same title. And that is also really different than agency context, generally speaking. And so that, I think, was kind of a transition for folks. I think the hardest one, though, and I say hard just because I think I can kind of empathize with this is, I've never worked in an agency. So I kind of learned this by observing these folks who are now all my friends going through it. When you're on an agency, one of the most important things that you want to avoid is going over budget. But even when they were working for us as an agency, we're like, we throw away work all the time. Like, if you actually get 6 weeks into this and think that it's not the right thing, you should definitely tell us and we should throw it out and start something new. And I think, like, being in a context where you throw away a ton of work is hard for folks who have been in an environment where the clients really want you to do the brief, nail it, and then be done. And so it's really liberating, obviously, once you get past that point, but it's a cultural shift for people.
Let's just take this one question right here.
Facebook recently split almost Facebook I'm just curious from a design and user experience perspective.
I don't work
Repeat
on
the question, please.
Yeah, so he's talking about the Facebook app splitting into a separate application. I don't work on the project, so I can't really comment on kind of what happened with that announcement. I will say that, when you see a house that's had 800 additions and it starts to lose its sense of itself and it can't actually function as a living space anymore, mobile applications are like that. There's only so much functionality that you can shoehorn into something until it starts to break down. And so I think what we really believe is true is that certain experiences will be much better when they are focused experiences. Hyperlapse is a great example of this. If you guys haven't tried it, I didn't work on it. It's this amazing new app that the Instagram team built. It has one thing, which is these amazing time-lapse videos. And they could have built it into Instagram. It actually works much better as a separate application. So I think, how we go through these transitions is a topic that I'm not the best person to talk about, but the idea of having separate applications, I really feel is actually in people's best interest. So we don't expect the main app to try to do everything that Facebook could build. It's just not a great strategy.
All right, we'll close with that unless Brian, I'm wondering if you wanted to say anything more. Okay, thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Margaret.
Test. Hi everyone. Thank you for staying. I know this is the last event before the reception, so thanks a lot. We spoke, both Amazon and Facebook are consumer brands, although Margaret works in the enterprise side of Facebook. We're going to switch now to enterprise. How many of you work in an enterprise system? Great, it's about 50-50. So we are, I work at SAP, so let me share with you a little anecdote. This summer I had a chance to talk to some design students to find out from them what they wanted to do after they graduated. Many of them wanted to go to startups, as Brian was alluding to earlier, and some of them wanted to go to recognizable consumer brands, and none of them, surprise, surprise, said enterprise software. And as I talked to them some more, it was clear that they really didn't have an idea of what that meant, and they didn't know that there were exciting opportunities for designers to make a difference in the lives of everyday working people. So in this talk, I want to convince you, or at least make the case, that such opportunities do exist, and in fact, actually, there has never been a better time to be an enterprise software designer. My name is Janaki Kumar. I work in a team called the Design and Co-Innovation Center. Some of my team members are here today. We are sort of an agency within SAP. So we get to work with customers directly on their strategic projects, user experience, design, co-innovation. Margaret was talking about boot camping their enterprise designers into a domain, specifically the ads domain. In our case, we go from domain to domain, from project to project. So it's a constant learning experience, but it also makes it really exciting. So 50% of you said you didn't know about enterprise software, so let me give an idea of what that is. So when you order something online, on your favorite shopping site, and it arrives at your door, everything that happens in between is enterprise software. An order is created, an invoice is cut, it could be inventory is checked. If needed, raw material is purchased or production is initiated, and you have, and then finally shipping and logistics, and the product arrives at the consumer site. And all these activities have to be recorded accurately in the company's financial books, and the employees need to be paid. So the salaries and the benefits of the employees have to be taken care of. So in a nutshell, enterprise software runs businesses. A quick fun fact, 70% of the world's transactions runs through an SAP system. So the decision making of the enterprise software is usually done by management and the IT staff. And in this game, features always win. Now the vendors, like SAP, respond to it, and we add more and more features into the product. And our customers hire an army of consultants, and they add even more features. The problem with this is that it leads to complexity. And the enterprise worker, who is actually the end user of this product, rarely has a voice in this process. But this is changing. With the ubiquitous availability of smart devices, social media, consumer websites, people really expect the same ease of use in their enterprise software as their consumer software, and why not? We deserve it. IT and management are paying attention. Now, user experience is being seen as greater productivity, increased user adoption, reduced errors, reduced training, and companies want to use it to drive business innovation. And this is great news for enterprise software designers, because finally, there is a solid business case for good design. However, companies are unprepared to to meet this shift from features to experience. For this to happen, you really need a confluence of business viability, technical feasibility, and human values. Companies know their business very well. They know they have a good handle on technology. However, they lack design. Let's just quantify what this means, where the gap is. So it's in the software industry, it's considered best practice to have one designer for every 10 developers. So if you follow the agile methodology, which many software vendors do, companies do, if you have a team of 10 developers, you need to have at least one designer. Many firms are doing much better, I'm happy to report. For a team of 10, there are 7 developers, 2 designers, and 1 PM. But let's say for the sake of argument, let's just take the conservative estimate of 1:10. Vendors, like SAP, the ratio goes up to 1:100. We have an employee base of 65,000 employees, roughly half of them are developers, and with our designers, this brings us roughly to the 1:100 ratio. However, what we do is we shift our resources to the strategic and new projects, so for those areas, the ratio becomes closer to 1:10. But the shock is, when we look at our customers, the ratio is more like 1:1000. It is not unusual for our customers like Nestle or Walmart or John Deere to employ an IT staff of 1,000 internal and external consultants to modify the software to their unique business needs, to their industry, to their region. And in these large IT projects, they have 1 or maybe 5 designers. Many of these customers have a mix of cloud and on-premise deployments, and they work really hard to make sure that the systems work seamlessly together so that the information from one part of the business flows into the other. They have to meet their high customer expectations as well as enable their employees and their managers to make good decisions. However, this is changing as well. So customers are seeing the need for using the power of design and technology to transform their business. And many customers come to us these days to set up user centers of excellence within their IT organizations. Now, if this trend picks up, let's just estimate the demand for designers. Here is the good news. So just knowing the SAP landscape, since I have those numbers, SAP has a total customer base of 250,000. So 250,000 businesses, which has many more employees within those businesses. So like a Walmart is our customer. Now, the total number of customers of SAP is 250,000. Let's just take the top 50,000, the largest customers who have the resources. And let's assume that they decide to upgrade their ratio of designers to developers to, they just hire 100 designers. If they decide to do that, the total demand for enterprise designers will skyrocket to 5 million. Now, the actual numbers are not critical. The point is that when businesses decide to use the power of design, user experience, and technology to transform their business, to seriously do that, there's going to be a skyrocketing demand for enterprise designers who can solve these complex business problems. And this will also have a ripple effect across other businesses. When the large businesses are using it for their competitive advantage, other businesses are going to follow. But simply adding just the numbers is not enough. We need a culture change. Businesses need a culture change in order to enable this shift from features to experience. So let me just tell you a little bit of the SAP story. We have hired more designers. We have the fortunate position of our executive leadership giving us the resources to hire more designers. We've hired a cross-functional team of designers with a variety of skill sets, design thinking, user research, interaction design, visual design, prototyping. And Margaret was alluding to it earlier and saying that the teams are becoming more cross-functional user experience team, and this is certainly our experience as well. We encourage our teams to be more T-shaped, which we mean that our designers have a core expertise, but they also spread and grow in other areas as well. And we bring them all together so that the teams can work together and inspire each other. We have completely transformed our workspace. We have removed our cubicles and moved into a more open, collaborative, and a creative workspace. We call these app houses, and interestingly, many of our customers who have been coming to visit us and tour us are asking us to create such app houses in their environments as well. And how many of you are familiar with the design thinking methodology? Okay, few of you. Okay, so we work very closely with Stanford D-School, and we use the design thinking methodology as our process. And what that allows us to do is a tool for innovation. We, when we are faced with a business problem, we try to reframe the problem. We diverge. We look at the problem space from different perspectives, and then we converge to find the solution. It's really a process of innovation. And so we believe that the key ingredients to a culture of innovation are, having the right talent with the right environment and adopting a design-friendly process. We've made a lot of organizational changes as well. We have Sam Yen, who is our Chief Design Officer. Everyone has heard of Chief Financial Officer and a Chief Technology Officer, but it's great to have a Chief Design Officer, and it really shows the support the company has for the practice of design. We have a central user experience team that has the standards and guidelines and really sets the tone on the strategy of SAP user experience. We have a consumer UX team that creates products that allows our customers to connect to their customers. And we have the Design and Co-Innovation Center, which is a team that I and a few others are part of. And we work directly with our customers to transform or to translate the user experience strategy of SAP into their landscape and bring it into their reality through these strategic engagements. And we also have several lines of businesses at SAP, and each lines of business has their own user experience team that works on product releases, and they dotted line back to Sam. And let's see what our investment has allowed us to create. This is the new face of SAP. We have simplified the large monolithic application into a collection of applications called Fiori. And let me run a short video that will explain what that is like. I lost my mouse. You see the users moving from mobile to tablet to other devices and really getting their work done as they need to. And we also have a few submissions to the UX Awards, and we, in our booth at SAP, we have a slideshow of all the various submissions. So if you want to learn more about the submissions, please feel free to take a look. And we are happy to be amongst the finalists for the Consumer Insight 365 Award. So to wrap up, you know, the shift from features to experience is upon us. We observe it, we welcome it. We think that this will create a huge demand for enterprise designers, designers who can take on this challenge. We also believe that simply adding designers is not enough, and we really have to add, encourage a culture shift in the organizations. And within SAP, we've created this cross-functional team of design talent, and we've created an open environment to facilitate this, as well as add a design-friendly process. So I encourage you to join me in this journey to transform the experience, the lives of the enterprise workers to be, I mean, just as easy to use as consumer products. Thank you. Any questions? Or okay.
So I have a question. I'm from outside of this entire world where you guys live and work. I'm a semiconductor professional. I'm very analytical, but I'm kind of looking at, so I'm extraordinarily and constantly frustrated by poor integration, poor user interface. Things don't work. They're not intuitive at all many times. So for somebody that's analytical like me, can you recommend kind of, if I was going to transition, make a career transition and move into either the design space or kind of the testing space, you know, I'm not an artistic, like creative guy. I'm more kind of analytical and, wow, that's wrong, and document that and stuff. Can you make any suggestions about like what area of either the UX or the
Yeah. I think anyone who has the ability to have a systems thinking, we call it systems thinking, someone who can have a large problem space in mind. Because in enterprise, the challenge is you have multiple stakeholders taking a view at the same data. And in consumer products or a website, you have one user doing one task. It's pretty linear, and there's no downstream impact of that person's action on everything else that's going on. So in an enterprise, there is this dependent, you know, like almost a matrix of stuff that's going on. So anyone who has the cognitive ability to really think in that systems way, I think that's a skill that you already have. Now, in addition to that, you need to be able to have a deep empathy for this end user to represent them and drive that design aspect. I mean, there are various ways to do that. There are, if you're interested in user experience, there are some course. I mean, I saw Tradecraft and General Academy and others that can give you that, you know, skill set from a user experience perspective, and given your background, it could be a great synergy. Yeah.
Could you share a bit more about the user research part, like how the team work together to communicate with
Yeah, so I can speak for our team, and I have some colleagues here who can add more information. So we get to work with the customer. And I'll give you an example. We looked at an ice cream truck delivery scenario. So there's a person who's stocking ice cream, and then they and all this information is coming, you know, into a central database, right? So and the managers want to look at it, the store owners, and so on and so forth. So what we do is sometimes do ride-alongs. We go with the drivers to see what do they do, what information do they collect, how do they do it. It's a lot of fun, actually. And then you bring it all in. And what the design thinking process is, the core difference between our traditional user experience and design thinking, in my opinion, is when we did user research, we would create a nice report, a 100-page report, and you hand it over to the product team and say, voila, we did research, we did all this ethnographic research, and here's what we learned. And then they kind of read half of it, they get half of it, they're not sure. In design thinking, we don't do that. We bring them all into a room. So maybe a room like this, right? And we would share our findings. We would do 360 research. We would bring their stakeholders' perspective into it as well. And then we would look at the problem space first broad. So that's called divergent thinking. And then we converge and say, what are the key problems that we can fix? Because we'll uncover 100 problems. We can't fix everything, right? So we need to focus in on what are the key things we want to fix.
And once we identify the problems we want to fix, then we diverge again and find solutions. We iterate, we maybe do quick prototypes, sketches, get quick user feedback, diverge, and then we find the solution that works for us. So it's a slightly different type of user research, but I think it's more fun. Yes.
I'm kind of curious to learn more about the culture change aspect. As you mentioned,
Yeah.
I work in enterprise, and
Okay.
when you're in enterprise, like talking about user experiences is usually the last thought, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, who are the people that normally come to you guys and say we need this help? And is it normally coming to say we want more features, and you guys come in and say, oh, by the way, you can consider this? Or are there actually people that are coming from IT or from management and saying, hey, you know what, we actually want to transform how our operations work?
So remember I said there is a solid business case for good design? That is the key. So I think when I meet with senior executives or business folks, I don't try to sell design for design's sake. You don't want to preach to them, but rather try to kind of empathize with them and say, you know what, you're going to get more productivity from your call center worker. You're going to they're going to make less errors, right? If we actually go in and find out what they're doing, maybe yes, it takes that upfront time upfront to learn about exactly what they do, but they're going to make less errors. You don't need to train them. You don't need to send them for 2 weeks for training. You can put them right away because we know exactly what they're going to do. So sell it to them from a different angle.
Are you talking to people like at the COO, CFO level, or are you talking to middle managers? Like who is it? Because normally the people who feel the pain are people down there.
Yeah, yeah.
So who are you talking to?
So in our work, so SAP, I mentioned there are many different groups. So in the Design and Co-Innovation Center, it's mostly a C-level request. So it will come from the top, and then we engage with the IT managers who are responsible for their enterprise systems. And then they have a team, it's usually a global organization. They have a team of people underneath them. So it goes like that. But what we do is, we found in our experience, the IT managers are starting to get it, right? Because they want to have that better relationship with lines of business. The resistance comes a little bit lower in the food chain. So when we do our design thinking, we make sure we engage with them as well. And so that's how it's been working. And really, it's each customer will have a certain hook that will resonate with them, and we just have to try different arguments and see what works. Great, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the reception.
All right, so just let me hook this up. Second. Beautiful. Okay. All right, so maybe just take a second to shake out. See, I'm being empathetic already. Hi everyone. I want to take just one quick second to recognize the fact that today is 9/11. A few of us judges came from New York, and you sort of, when you're there, you just feel it inside and out everywhere you go. There's fire trucks, there's a lot, and it's really easy to kind of forget what happened on that day. So please keep that in mind. And now I'll jump into talking about empathy. So, quickly, a little bit about me. So, I was born in Israel and grew up in St. Louis and then the Bay Area. So I actually then moved to New York. So I actually have a mix of kind of East Coast, West Coast, and nutty Middle Eastern. I had the opportunity to go to Stanford and got a bachelor's and then a master's in mechatronics and mechanical engineering, which was an awesome mix of robotics, so mechanical, electrical, computer science. And even back then, the Stanford degree in mechanical engineering was really influenced by product design. So my roots are very akin to IDEO, very influenced by IDEO type thinking, user-centered design, etc. I also did a minor in communication and a shit ton of improv. So if anything fails, we'll do like a sketch or something. So then I had kind of a pre-quarter life crisis and moved across the country to New York and found this little tiny agency with 10 people, a little digital agency called Huge. And I was there for 10 years. Todd, who spoke before, was from there, and there are a few other Hugers here today, or ex-Hugers. When I left last spring, I was Chief Experience Officer, and the company was 750 people. So kind of a crazy ride for 10 years. And since then, I've been taking some time to travel, doing some personal projects and some consulting, and also doing a bit of reflecting, and that's what got me to kind of really start thinking about empathy. So I want to talk to you today about it and my own personal experience and how I think it can help us become better designers. So empathy is actually was a big topic in German philosophical circles for a long time. Is my mic working? Hello? Okay. And it actually means feeling into, so versus sympathy, which is a feeling with, it's Einfühlung, feeling into. And this, I love these, when you look up a word on Google and you get the little kind of spark line. This is actually cheating a bit because the word wasn't introduced into English until 1909. So it wasn't going to be used before that. But if you look now today, you see empathy everywhere. Everybody's talking about it. There's a ton of articles. I literally was doing research for the talk and couldn't keep up with the number of search results that kept coming up and new articles. So everything, startups everywhere, right? We've heard enough. Shut up, Mikkel. Okay. So I have a question for you guys. Are you empathetic? So raise your hand if you feel you're an empathetic person. It's not a trick question. Okay, so most people, and it's of course pretty essential to design. So I thought I was too. I was certain that I was an empathetic person. I was a pretty sensitive kid. There was a time when I was even in high school, there was this attendant, like a assistant in the math department, and all of the other women around her were like taking her to town and really, talking shit about her and all this, and it upset the hell out of me. So I went and wrote a letter to the principal, and I sat down with him and spoke with him about it. So, I was fighting the good fight, right? And I've seen that a few times. So I really thought I was. But that changed for me on May 24th, 2013. Does anyone know the significance of that date? Probably not. That was the day I got married to a woman. This is our wedding photo. So what's interesting is, growing up, I had a lot of gay friends, even before I was out or kind of had figured things out for myself. Was marched in, pride parades and even, in support of gay marriage. And so I really considered myself, especially, kind of gay friendly and a gay supporter. And when we got married, we were just so excited. We went to City Hall. It had been legal for a couple years in New York. And then, we start to think, okay, so we're going to get to do, all these tax savings and all this shit. And, I had even told people, oh, well, there's 1,138 rights that people don't get, but it didn't really mean anything to me, bizarrely, until I was actually in this weird purgatory where literally by filing federal taxes, I could be fined by the federal government for lying, for saying that I was married when I wasn't, because you couldn't be legally married in the federal government's eyes, And this fucked with me to no end. I mean, it really, really shattered my world. Because I felt like I had let down so many people before me for kind of, you know, paying lip service but not really internalizing what people were going through. But B, because, you know, I got married, I pay taxes, I pay Social Security, why do I not have these rights? It was a really strange time for me. Fortunately for us, it was only a month. DOMA was overturned, you know, literally a month later, and it's the first and only time I wrote a letter like this to the team. I'm just going to read it to you for fun. So, hi team, it's pretty rare that I get on a soapbox at work, but today is a very important day for me personally and for our country, so I'm making an exception. When Sue and I got married a month ago in City Hall, after 10 years together, we were over the moon. But when we started to see the inequalities, paying far more federal taxes, not getting health insurance breaks that other married couples get, and more, it felt like we'd only gotten halfway there. I can't tell you what it feels like to pay more taxes to a country that treats you like a second-class citizen. In fact, had I submitted taxes with Sue as my spouse, I could have been fined for lying to the government. And my wound is fresh. This has been going on for same-sex couples for years, not to mention interracial couples before them and countless others before them. Today, all that changed with one Supreme Court decision. Today, we took a stand as a country and said that we value our people and our equality over our fear of the different. Today, my faith was restored in our slow-moving democracy. I'm proud and thankful for those who came before us and fought the tough battles, and now I'm ready to fight for the next group of people who aren't getting a fair shake. I hope you are too. Mrs. McKell-Pasternak. All right, hopefully you're all getting the goosebumps that I'm getting. But basically my takeaway is I thought I was so empathetic, and empathy is really fucking hard to achieve. Oftentimes until you are actually in someone else's shoes, or your situation changes and you're now in a new situation, that's when you actually really fully internalize what it feels like. And it's a dangerous thing. You know, there's a friend of mine who's incredibly empathetic, and she has trouble functioning in society because she feels everyone else's pain. You know, it's not that fun. It's more fun to be the person who is a wall and just walks around, you know, kind of bruising everyone else and not really paying attention. But for designers, we don't have that luxury. We have to be empathetic. So we carry a lot of assumptions with us, like I did, even about ourselves and how much we can process. But if you think about it, empathy or inability to empathize causes a lot of interpersonal strife on teams, in relationships, all of those things, which is why I fully believe the genre of the body swap film is so successful. So this is Freaky Friday. This is 18 again, vice versa. In all of these, I didn't know it was like a narrative thing, the body swap, a narrative structure. So in all of these situations, a girl trades places with her mom, or an old guy trades places with a young guy, and you know they keep their same voice and their brain, but they're in someone else's body, and they really come out at the end of the movie kind of knowing something. This one is, has anyone heard of or seen Double Switch, this Disney movie? Oh my God. Okay, I was obsessed with it as a kid. I think it's because we had literally the VHS of it. I don't know how. But this is a slightly different genre where they look very similar. It's a rock star and a regular old Joe in high school, and they switch personalities, you know, because the other person's life looks so great. Anyway, and they realize it's not, and their life was good. So, empathy is really, really important for vital design. When it's there, you actually don't notice the design at all because it anticipated what you needed, right? It's the best design to me is obvious, simple, and it really gets out of your way. Maybe it's sometimes playful, something like that, but it's fun. When it's missing, it's so obvious and annoying. And this, I had this moment in the DC airport last year where I was just completely befuddled. Someone here mentioning, Janice mentioned how we get annoyed. I just couldn't believe how disorganized the airport security lines were. They know literally exactly how many people are traveling and exactly at what time. You know, at least a kind of a window. It's within a 2-hour window, something like that. So how can they not know how many security things they're going to have open? All of these things just drives me crazy. Healthcare.gov was a really good example. And then there's those form fields that are really, really long, and you fill out all your stuff, and you get one thing wrong, and it erases everything. And it still drives me insane. It drives me insane. I almost pick up the phone or email someone, but sometimes I'm too lazy. Who's heard of this? The GE Healthcare? A few of you. Okay, so this is empathy in action, and it's actually in the book that the IDEO guys wrote as well. Actually, I learned about it from a design friend. And so Doug Dietz was a designer for GE Healthcare who hadn't been trained as a designer. But he finished up, he and his team designed a new state-of-the-art CT scanner. I mean, this thing had everything that GE wanted, that the customers want, everything. It was perfect. And so on the day that he's going to they're implementing it, they're talking to the attendants, he sees a little girl in the hallway, and she's scared out of her mind. And she's going to have to go into CT scans. She needs them frequently because she's pretty sick. And she's just afraid, totally afraid and crying. And he has this moment of kind of an aha, like, wow, we designed this amazing thing, and this little girl is still so fucking scared. The machines, you should know, make a lot of noise. So there's like a boom, 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 you know, really scary, loud noises. You have to be strapped down. I should have put a regular machine first. I guess I kind of screwed up my own narrative. So he went and actually got training for user-centered design, came back, and what they ended up with was this beautiful thing. So they have it's called the Adventure Series. They're installed in children's hospitals all over the country, and they basically create a whole story for the kids. So they get to put on a costume, and in this one they go underwater, so it even justifies some of the sounds that the kids hear, and it just makes everything make sense and easy and fun and just completely delightful. So he said that, you know, even though he's got awards and all this, a lot of accolades for this thing, the thing that made the biggest difference for him was another little girl was, you know, went through it, and afterwards she said, "Mommy, can we come back again tomorrow?" You know, that's insane. That's empathy in action for me. And I think Janice mentioned this also, you know, design is optimism. We believe that we can improve the human experience by solving problems. So how can we achieve greater empathy? So I have a few suggestions. I'm sort of even though I've been designing for a long time, I sort of feel like I'm at the beginning of my journey. Still learning how to be more empathetic, because I'm still relatively at the beginning of my marriage too. You know, we've been together like 10 years also. So one, get as close to the user as possible. So this isn't just end users, as Turi pointed out, and a few others, and you know, Todd's research was really interesting about kids. We've, you know, grown up, it's really hard to kind of make that mental leap back. But it's also with developers and editors, the people who are going to build and maintain and manage whatever experience you're going to build. We did iVillage.com many years ago, and when we started, we were going to do kind of a replatforming, and we talked to one of the editors. It took her 4 hours to make a 10-slide slideshow. And she already had the content. It was just uploading it to this weird backwards CMS. I mean, it was insane. So we were able to help her and a bunch of other people. And, you know, one thing that I've realized is it's much easier to design for yourself. So we did HBO Go. There were a lot of people, I mean, it came really easy for them. They worked their butts off on the design. For me, one of the last projects I did with Huge was nyc.gov, which was a big passion project for mine. One, because I got to fix the alternate side parking problem, so I now know right away on the site if I have to move my car or not. But also because I'm a New Yorker, so it was easy to, you know, and I've used the site. It was easy for me to kind of make that leap and understand what some of the needs would be. ThirdAge.com, this was 5 or 6 years ago. Huge worked with them on a redesign of their website. This is, they were trying to become sort of a community, not exactly social network, but sort of a community for baby boomers. And it was literally 4 20-somethings sitting with these 60+, and they were just looking at us with, you know, stone cold faces, like, how are these kids going to know how to design this experience for us? They gave us a book about the aging brain. You know, they started to help us try to empathize. So it was much, much harder, both working with the clients, but also kind of identifying with and empathizing with the end users there. So that means you should know and test your assumptions constantly, and those things change. And as you become more experienced as a designer, you start to make a lot more assumptions, like, this won't work. I tested this 3 years ago. But even those things change because technology is changing so quickly. So this is really important, and especially if you're less likely. I think there are a lot of shortcuts that you can take, like I said, if you're close to the thing. Now, stay focused. So I think it's very easy, and this is really similar to the kind of that product approach that Janice was talking about, product development. it's really easy to get lost in the methods and the methodologies and the tools and the this and the that, especially at an agency like Huge. We were scoping projects and we had, you literally had to do certain things. You check them off. Even if you kind of realize midstream, maybe we don't really need to do this, you sort of still had to do it because it was in a contract and this and that. And Huge is improving, their scoping processes all the time to try to avoid that. But if you look at the list of kind of your standard old school UX methods, a lot of them are about improving your empathy. A persona you do to help yourself and to help your clients kind of really imagine their customers or their end users. But a lot of them have gotten way out of control, and you end up spending more time making a document. I've seen 100-page personas. When you're thinking about and documenting what someone who's buying a car has had for breakfast for 5 days, something's wrong. You shouldn't be spending your time on that, So I think it's really being mindful about what your end goal is and staying focused on that. Your end goal is creating X experience or solving X problem or identifying what problem you're trying to solve. It's not doing these things. These things are all tools to help you become more empathetic and to help you help your clients and your teammates become more empathetic. So I think it's really important to get scrappy, not in the example that Turi gave about health aid for the future generations of the world, but for a lot of projects that you do, you can get really scrappy. My poor wife is like my #1 user tester for anything. Just to see if something makes sense, I'll give her a gut check for things. And don't let budget be your excuse. I've interviewed people and I said, oh, so did you put this in front of someone? Did you test it? No, there was no budget. I'm like, fuck that. Do you have a friend who's kind of like this person? This is not rocket science, and it's not science. In most cases, a lot of the work we do, people are not going to be dying. It's not everyone. Some people work in healthcare. There are high risks, and so caveat. But in most cases, you can test something with someone else. It's very helpful to see someone else use something. And it, again, creates empathy. So don't get so caught up in being so formal about methods or anything like that. Just get scrappy and put it in front of someone. And then practice every day, and this is the one I'm really working on. There are a lot of opportunities to empathize everywhere, large and small. You can do it today. You can do it, wherever. So watch Fox News if you only watch MSNBC. I've been doing that a little bit. It's hard. But talk to your bus or Uber driver. Get to know them. Learn about someone who's different than you. One really interesting thing is Humans of New York. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. You should really follow it. It's really cool. It's a guy he started just documenting, taking pictures of people in New York and asking them a question. Very simple, just the photo and a snippet of their story. And now he's traveling around the world to really troubled places. He was in Ukraine, he was in Iraq and Syria. So really interesting stuff, and just gets you, you're like looking at your Instagram feed and your friends posting their beer and their this and their that, and then you're like, whoa, this is another human on the other side of the planet. So for us, this is the emergency page for nyc.gov. We knew we were going to do an emergency page, but we were given empathy by force in this case. Hurricane Sandy literally hit the week that we were designing this page. So it was perfect and shitty and scary. But we learned a bunch of things. So one was the hierarchy of information. There's some information that is so important, it's even worth a label, critical info. It's so important. It could be life or death for some people. I was in the East Village. My power was out for a week, and a reactor kind of exploded in the East Village. And it turned out to be fine. No one was injured. It wasn't dangerous, but those are the kinds of things you really need to know about. Then also we realized through experience that our internet service was incredibly spotty. Internet was down completely. Mobile service was really, really spotty. So everything about the page, it had to load really quickly, mostly text, just keep it light and simple. And then as things started to recover, there were some areas where you really wanted to know, can I get around? I actually walk across the Brooklyn Bridge to work every day. Carrying every electronic device I had to go into work and charge everything. But this is the kind of information you need. What's up, what's working, what's dangerous, what's not. And then last, there was a lot of confusing information flying around. So literally you would hear something and then it wouldn't be true 5 minutes later. It's an emergency. Things are going nuts. Literally trees are blowing around. So I think it got cut off, but we designed sort of a strikeout system. So you can look and see the latest updates, and as they change, if something is no longer true, we'll keep it on the page so you don't think you're crazy, no, we did say that, but now that is actually not true, or we verified it, or whatever it is. So really simple stuff. So I'll just be one more minute. So keep pushing. More empathy will improve your design and all of your interactions, and it's something that you can practice, I think. I'll get back to me in a year. But it's something that you can get better at. And then I want to end just with one really quick thing. Henry David Thoreau. So I'm going to read this. You've probably heard of Henry David Thoreau and his experience living in Walden Pond. So here's a part you may not know. In late July of 1846, a little more than 1 year into his stay at Walden Pond, Thoreau was arrested for refusing to pay a tax that was used to help finance the United States war with Mexico and supported the enforcement of slavery laws. According to some accounts, Thoreau's friend and fellow writer and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Thoreau in jail and asked, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" Thoreau replied, "Waldo, the question is, what are you doing out there?" And he went on to write on civil disobedience, which influenced Martin Luther King, Gandhi, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'll leave you with that. It's the end. Any good time for? Maybe not? Okay. Any questions? Are you all feeling a little more empathetic? All right, cool. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there. I know it's kind of a long afternoon, so it's a stretch, I guess. Great. Great. So my name is Alex Wright. I'll just introduce myself briefly. My day job is I work as the director of research at Etsy. In previous life, I worked at the New York Times, where I managed the user experience team for about 6 years. And then before that, I worked at various agencies, startups you've never heard of, and so forth. But I'm not going to talk about any of that work today. And what I want to do today is take a little bit of a left turn. And what I'm particularly interested in talking about today are, not projects that have gotten built, which is really largely why we're here today, is to celebrate some great work that's been done. But I want to talk a little bit about those projects that haven't gotten built. And in a way, you could say this talk is sort of a defense of vaporware. I feel like vaporware has gotten kind of a bad rap lately. There's sort of this meme out there in the UX world that ideas are cheap and execution is what really matters. And and I get that argument, but I want to push back on that a little bit. And the way I want to do that is by taking a little bit of a historical view of things and introducing you to some ideas that preceded the world that we live in today that are maybe not as well understood or as well known as they could be. And to look at these as examples of, I think, what you might call platonic objects or sort of, idealized concepts that I think, have had a lasting influence on the way things ultimately have played out. And I think it's worth, I think in the sort of, internet world, there's a bit of a lack of kind of historical awareness around what we do. We tend to be a little bit fixated on the future and on what the next shiny new thing is. And I'd just like to invite you to, today to maybe take a step back and try to, open your mind to the possibility of some earlier precursors of, of hypertext in the web that might spark some new thinking about ways we could think about the problems some of us are trying to solve today. So this is one of those visualizations of the web. This is kind of a network diagram that sort of represents the topology of the internet. So there's lots of stuff out there. There's no particular central organizing structure to it. It just kind of happens, really. And for a lot of us, the experience of it is something like this, right? So, cheap laugh. But the web has been around in its sort of current incarnation since the early 90s. But there's a longer heritage to the development of network information systems, and I want to kind of introduce that to you a little bit and talk about some possible reference points that might be interesting. So the one kind of concept car design that a lot of people know about, I'm curious, does this look familiar to anybody? Yeah, a few folks, yeah. So this is sort of often cited as one of the conceptual forerunners of personal computing and hypertext.
It's a diagram of a machine called the Memex that was first proposed in 1945 by a guy named Vannevar Bush, who was a very influential scientist during World War II. He was an advisor to President Roosevelt. And he wrote this essay called As We May Think, where he talked about this idea of a machine that could be used primarily by researchers to sort of draw connections between different topics. The idea was it all ran on microfilm, and you could have basically a tool that would allow you to pull up an article on one topic and then pull up an article on another topic and sort of draw connections between them, or what he called links. So this essay proved to be quite influential. It went on to be read pretty far and wide. People like Doug Engelbart, J.C.R. Licklider, some of the, eventually Ted Nelson, people who really kind of paved the way for hypertext and eventually the web to take shape. Really, there's a pretty clear paper trail that you can trace back to this essay. So, so this is, I think, and the interesting story here is that Bush never intended to build this thing. He had actually tried to build something like this in the 1930s and was frustrated by the limitations of the available technology at the time. He was not able to solve some of the kind of thorny index problems and some of the mechanical engineering problems. And eventually he just kind of threw up his hands and said, this is not getting me anywhere. What I really need to do is talk about an ideal state that might exist with future technology. And the result of which is, all of the, he was himself a prolific inventor. He was a mechanical engineer. He created all kinds of things, most of which have been completely forgotten. The only, concept that really had any lasting impact was the one that never got built, right? So this is, I think, a great example of a very influential vaporware that had a pretty wide-ranging impact. But Bush was not the first guy to think along these lines. As early as the 19th century, people were starting to think about the possibilities of networks, things like telegraphs and early experiments with electricity and pneumatic tube networks and things were starting to take shape. People were starting to see that something interesting was happening here, that networks were taking shape and that there were sort of early forms of electronic communication starting to take shape. People were starting to think about this. One of the really interesting, I think, conceptual forebears of this stuff was a guy named Albert Robida. He was a French novelist who wrote a book in 1883 called The 20th Century. And it revolved around this device called a telephonoscope. That's what he called it. And the idea is it would be a screen-based mechanism that would allow you to pull up words and images, and it would be connected to a network. And these are sort of some of his, he was a novelist and an illustrator, and there's some of his illustrations of what it might look like. So the idea would be that you could have these big kind of displays with kind of audiovisual material. A gentleman could come home after a hard day's work and turn on his telephonoscope, I guess, ça change, I guess. And he also imagined this idea that you could have audio broadcasts. So this was an idea of people being on a subway car in Paris, and they could have little earphones where they would be plugged in to catch the latest news or popular novels or music broadcasts. So it's kind of like, sort of analog, podcasting kind of thing. So this is a very interesting time, the late 19th century. A lot of things were changing. Industrialization was happening. Networks were starting to happen, and people were starting to contemplate, new ideas about how information could be organized and distributed. There was a guy named Charles Cutter, who was a well-known librarian, an American librarian, and he wrote this essay also in 1883 called The Buffalo Public Library of 1983, where he started to imagine what a library could look like in the future. So he came up with this crazy idea of a keyboard that was connected to a wire that you could use to pull up images of books that could be displayed on a screen and then sort of sent back into a central repository. Other people started to think along these lines as well. The English novelist H.G. Wells was really pretty intrigued by this idea. He wrote a number of essays over the years that were eventually collected in a book called The World Brain, where he described this idea of a kind of global networked encyclopedia, very much like a Wikipedia kind of idea that anyone could contribute to, and that would have, everyone in the world would have a user ID. He kind of looked at the whole problem of authentication and identity management and thought about, he had a much better idea of how it could all work. And the idea would be that anybody could then access this this repository, and he imagined that eventually all human thought would be connected in this network that would be available to anyone in the world. So there are other folks who were kind of speculating about this. Even Mark Twain, he wrote one of his lesser short stories called From the London Times of 1904, where he introduced this idea of what he called a limitless distance telephone. It was very much a similar idea of a terminal, a terminal that you could use to pull words and images and get updated on anything that was going on in the world. So these were a few early concepts that were floating around. But a lot of this was just pretty speculative stuff. Like, people weren't really trying to build this stuff. But one guy that did try to at least begin to attempt to build something like this is a fellow not many folks have heard of, a guy named Paul Lay. He was a Belgian guy who worked in the early 20th century mostly. And kind of the sort of elevator pitch about Paul Lay is that he actually invented something very much like the internet in the 1930s and was promptly forgotten in sort of the midst of World War II. He died during the war, and a lot of his work was forgotten and never translated into English. But some of the ideas he had, I think, were pretty provocative and are very, I think, useful kind of reference points for thinking about the way information could be structured in a networked world. This diagram sort of illustrates some of his basic ideas. He had this concept that you could take information that was stored in books and sort of extract it and store it on index cards. And the basic idea was to sort of go beyond just kind of cataloging books on a shelf, but to actually index the contents of those books, almost like a search engine, and to go in there and sort of apply a coding system and a linking system that would let you then draw connections between different documents and then allow people to recombine them in interesting kinds of ways. So, like I say, this was not just a concept. He actually started to build something along these lines. He got some funding from the Belgian government, and he initiated this project. It was called the Universal Bibliography, which eventually grew to contain over 15 million index cards with little bits of information on them. He hired a staff of people. You could actually send in a query via a telegraph for a small fee, and the staff would then consult the catalog and would then pull up an answer to your query and send it back to you. Much of a search engine. And he collected all of these interesting gizmos and devices, telecommunications equipment. All of this started to take shape. He started to think beyond the idea of just a bibliography or a library. He actually started to build an actual physical representation of all this stuff. It became a giant museum. It was meant to be a world museum that eventually took up 150 rooms in a Belgian government building, where he collected information on all kinds of different topics. And the idea was it was kind of a learning museum. It wasn't like what you might typically think of as a museum, like a place where you see art or interesting artifacts. The idea was to use it as a real active learning tool that would allow anybody to explore a whole range of different topics. And so he worked with some graphic designers and his own library staff to create these very interesting kind of interfaces. I think have a real kind of hypertext kind of quality to them. So the idea was that you could enter this museum and sort of pick a topic, and then you would have these kind of introductory diagrams that kind of combined words and images and introduced you to the basic concepts. And then you could use these as kind of jumping off points to then go deeper into any topic by using this classification system he developed that would let you then kind of explore the whole collection. He also played around with other kind of crazy, like kind of Rube Goldberg kind of interfaces, like this, kind of like mechanical interfaces and tools for organizing information. And as he started to develop his ideas, he started to see, in the early 20th century, things like, telephone lines, radio, moving pictures, audio recordings were starting to come into focus, and he started to sort of expand his vision and think, well, what if you could develop a tool that could accommodate all these different kinds of media and actually catalog and collect all that stuff and then make it available over a network, over an electronic network that people could interface with via a screen sort of sitting in their living rooms. So he started to think pretty deeply about this. He also saw possible applications for education. For example, a university could broadcast lectures to a large audience, potentially limitless audience. You could have interfaces for transmitting. He even imagined transmitting the taste of smell or taste over the web. You could have the right kind of way of marking that up. And he imagined something like a workstation, like a terminal that could sit in somebody's house. And the idea would be that this would be connected via a telegraph and would have a radio receiver that you could then use to kind of build a very personalized kind of collection of information on any topic that interested you. This is actually an artist in Belgium actually tried to recreate this thing from his drawings a few years ago with something like this. So as he continued to think about this, he really started to think about a sort of whole systems design that was beyond just a kind of information retrieval tool. He saw this as part of a very utopian kind of idea that there would be kind of a governing body managing this whole thing that would actually be part of a new world government with this kind of centralized collection at its core. And his idea was that eventually, there would be some sort of governing body that would unite and sort of manage all the world's information and make it freely available to anyone in the world. I think one of the interesting aspects about Lei's concept was that there was almost no commercial activity taking place. He really didn't envision anybody buying or selling things. He didn't really envision any kind of particular social networking features, although he did think you could have like the ability to kind of applaud or sing in the chorus, as he put it, kind of like you could like things, but he didn't really envision the sort of person-to-person aspect of things. And he definitely didn't envision it as a tool for making money. He really saw it as much more of a utopian idea for like making information freely available and helping to solve a lot of the world's problems through creating a kind of level playing field for information to be shared. In his later years, he started to really kind of glimpse something very much like the world we live in today. He started to imagine wireless communication happening, started to imagine this kind of network circling the globe, and really, by the time he died, he was really envisioning something that's really not far off from the world we live in today, although it differed in some fairly important respects. But then, as I mentioned, he died in the middle of World War II, and his work was largely forgotten for many years, but it's just kind of recently, I think, coming back into focus. And I think provides an interesting reference point that suggests some interesting alternative ways of thinking about some of the problems that we're dealing with today on the web, like the fact that it's very difficult to organize information in a coherent way across like multiple different domains or areas. There's a lack of kind of a coherent sort of organizing scheme at work, and he had some pretty deep insights about how something like that could work. So he also collaborated with a number of other people. I don't have time to talk about in much depth. A guy named Patrick Geddes, who had some interesting ideas around what he these kind of conceptual models for organizing information. He created these things that he called thinking machines. The idea was these were kind of tools for drawing connections between different topics and then making those available in a accessible way to people so that they could also kind of orient themselves to a particular topic space. Here's another example. He also worked with an interesting guy named Hendrik Anderson, who was a sculptor who had some interesting ideas about building a world city. The idea of this would be like a new world capital, which was eventually, he imagined it would be where like the League of Nations would be headquartered. And he and Lei actually worked together very closely on that and tried to explore how this kind of idea of organizing the world's information would affect the shape of like governing systems and larger organizational structures that could help provide a kind of a sort of a new world order, you could say, or utopian kind of idea. Another contemporary about Lei was a guy named Emanuel Goldberg, also largely forgotten. He was working in the 1930s at a company called Zeiss Icon in Germany, and he was working in this emerging technology of microfilm, and he developed a pretty interesting tool for basically indexing microfilm. The idea was using kind of light sensors and a sort of like punch card technique. You could index topics on microfilm and then create tools for querying against a body of microfilm. It was very much like a search engine kind of idea. Unfortunately, this work came to a halt also in World War II. He was persecuted by the Nazis and had to leave for Palestine and kind of stopped work on this project, which seemed to bear potentially a lot of promise. There's some speculation that the work that he did may have indirectly influenced some of the work that Bush eventually did that led to the Memex and so forth, although it's hard to find the direct paper trail there. But in the years after the war, the history of computers and information systems really became largely an Anglo-American kind of story, and that's the story that most of us know to the extent that we're aware of the history of technology. It's the sort of post-war history of computing is largely one that's told from an Anglo-American perspective through people like J.C.R. Licklider at MIT, who was the architect of the original ARPANET, which he originally described as, he called it an intergalactic network. And actually what he described was also a kind of vaporware. It was really, he was kind of joking that there would be something like that. Although his idea of an intergalactic network, what he really meant was like 5 computers that would be scattered around the world. He thought that would probably do the trick. But he was an interesting guy. He was a little bit of a, contrarian thinker. He was a little bit out there. And one of his proteges was a guy named Doug Engelbart, who was a researcher at Stanford Research Institute, funded by Licklider, and he developed one of the really lasting, I think, demos. One demo with just incredible impact. It's called the Mother of All Demos. It was given here in San Francisco in 1968, where he presented this concept of what he called the online system. And it was actually a working demo of a system that included a facility for hypertext linking. You could link one document to another. It had real-time video conferencing. It had a kind of live chat capability. They needed a tool for moving a cursor on a screen, so he invented a thing called the mouse to go with it, which is where the mouse comes from. And it really had a pretty profound impact on the subsequent development of the personal computer, and the sort of early hacker movement in the Bay Area. A lot of very influential early members of the Homebrew Computing Club were at this demo, and a lot of his collaborators went on to start Xerox PARC, where they invented Ethernet. They invented some of the early concepts for graphical user interfaces. And I think another great example piece, even though it was a real demo, it was really kind of a concept car design that proved quite provocative and to have kind of lasting influence. So I'm running out of time. I'm briefly just going to mention a couple people that are also worth knowing about. Ted Nelson, famously kind of contrarian, countercultural figure in the high-tech industry, kind of worked on the margins of the computer science industry for many years, but had some really profound ideas about he coined the term hypertext in the 1960s, and spent much of his career building this, specking out this kind of mythical system called Xanadu, which proved to be an apt term because it never really got built, although he's still plugging away at it. Sorry? Really? That was recent, right? Because I know it's had a rocky history, right? So, yeah. But he self-published a lot of books. He was a real kind of child of the 60s. He self-published a lot of interesting, provocative books that he self-published and self-illustrated that are kind of fascinating to read. And I think also, he had just a ton of ideas that have yet to kind of really see the light of day, but in a way his vision is much more sophisticated than the web as it exists today. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into it. It would be a topic for another day, but I encourage you to look into Ted Nelson on your own time. Here's just a quick snapshot of some of his work. This is a concept that he had for a concept he called transclusion, which is kind of a way of deep linking between documents. So, I hope this is at least slightly helpful in sort of introducing some ideas people may not have heard of. I feel like, just to bring it back to the present day, when I look around at a lot of the development that goes on these days, I don't see a lot of this kind of speculative design work going on. There are a couple of interesting submissions for the awards today that I think were along these lines, but I think as UX designers or people working in this world, I would just encourage us to think more broadly about more sort of idealized representations of what things could become. It's very easy to get into kind of the tactical build, and anyone who's ever worked on a project in this space knows you're always, at the end of the day, you end up making trade-offs and having to bring things into what's feasible within the constraints you're working in. But I think there should be room, and there needs to be room for more forward-thinking kind of speculative design, and I would encourage people to try to find those opportunities and create that space in your own work to think along these lines. So I'm out of time. I'll leave it here. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I wrote a couple of books about some of this stuff. And thank you. 5 minutes? Okay, I got 5 minutes. So, any questions?
Did you say the name of the Belgian designer who created the universal bibliography?
Yeah, it's this guy. His name is Paul Otlet, O-T-L-E-T.
Thank you.
All right, well, keep going. Thank you.
You guys hear me okay? Take that as a yes. Let me just try to use this clicker so I can move around a little bit. Okay, so For those who don't know me, I'm Cliff Kwong. I'm a design editor at Wired. Before that, I've been at Wired for about a year, and before that, I was at Fast Company for about 5 years, where I started the design site Co-Design and started their design awards and ran their design franchises, which some of you guys might be familiar with. So the point of my talk today, I think I wanted to maybe step back a little bit and kind of look at the moment that we find ourselves in. I think probably everybody here is probably, you know, a designer in some way or another. You guys are all UX professionals. You guys all think about user experience and how things are made easy and that kind of thing. So the question I want to ask is, like, why is this so important right now? Why are we even here, right? So let me just talk a little bit about that. I would argue right now that we're in a really interesting design moment. And, you know, you actually can learn a lot about this moment by looking at the sort of last design moment, where design really became something popular and present in the American culture. So this is Charles and Ray Eames, of course, you know, husband and wife. You know, the common, I think, you know, if you don't know their history, you probably assume, like, you know, a lot of their work was, you know, it was about this pure inventive process, or this pure process of looking at how people behaved and trying to create products that sort of conformed and embodied this new idea of what life should be. But in fact, there's actually a much more interesting story behind what begat a lot of their great designs, such as this one. This is the DCW chair. I'm sure you guys have all seen this in places like Design Within Reach and whatnot. This is a prototype. But in fact, actually, this chair began as an idea that they were trying to pursue of sort of creating wood that bent in really novel ways, right? And so they were really obsessed with this idea of creating wood that had an organic feel to it that was beyond what wood could do. But, you know, they tried and tried and tried, and it turns out that they failed. They failed until they set the work aside, and they were asked to work on a project for the military, working on splints. Working on splints for soldiers, because metal splints couldn't conform to the human body very well, and they hurt people. They would crack and they would bend. And so it turns out they sort of applied that wood process to the splints and created the splints that some of you guys may be familiar with. I actually don't have a photograph in here right now, but they created these splints, and the only thing that allowed them to work was this glue that was top secret, that was held classified by the military. And they finally had, in getting this military contract, they had this glue that the military really had no use for. And so they finally started using that glue. And then once the war ended, they finally had the materials available to them to actually create the chairs that we all know now, right? So the point of that, all that, is that basically, you know, the Eameses, sorry, I've got something a little bit out of order here. This is a design renaissance that was created by a surplus of technology, right? And the Eames actually, this would happen to them over and over and over again in their career. This, you can see them starting to create the molded fiberglass chairs that we all know. And it actually came from Air Force technology for creating radar dishes. Again, it was a design renaissance that was due to a surplus in technology. I think that we're living in a very similar time right now, and for reasons that I think you know, should become clear in a second. Right now we're dealing with an enormous surplus of technology. As one designer told me recently, now that we can make anything, the question is, what should we be making, right? And, you know, we deal with sensors, processor storage, all these things are getting cheaper by the minute, basically, right? And so now I think the question has become, you know, what to do with all this stuff. And designers have naturally fit into that void, because design is really the discipline that I like to say makes technology matter to people, or makes technology make sense to people. It is the why of all that technology. So I'd like to call this moment Silicon Modern. And I say that specifically to contrast it with the mid-century modern movement, again, which was both of these moments are driven by a surplus in technology. that I think is really novel to both eras. And I think it's actually only going to get better. And why do I think that? I think that there's some interesting things that are going on right now. You know, if you assume that sensors and processors and storage are all sort of commodified products, and the only way to make them more interesting or create new value from them is novel rearrangements of them, which is basically describes the entire consumer electronics space right now, then essentially all you have to differentiate on is ideas about user experience and UI, right? But that's an enormously hard thing to maintain over time. So in turn, it means that the playing field ends up being relatively flat, right? You see it in apps, you see it in software today right now. The barriers to entry are so low, and design is so easy to copy that you essentially have a virtuous circle, right? The only way to stay relevant in this environment is just to keep improving things constantly from a usability standpoint, right? So the question I want to ask is, you know, what defines this moment that I'm calling Silicon Modern? Let's go into some examples, I think, that'll be good to show what I mean. So I'm going to talk about 3 different goals, I think, that are going to characterize this age, just as, let's say, ideas about the new workforce informed mid-century modern, right? So goal number 1, less complexity. Now, that sounds pretty obvious. Some of you guys might recognize this guy, Bill Buxton, principal researcher at Microsoft. He was the inventor of the capacitive touchscreen. And Bill actually, you know, came up with a lot of interesting ideas, one of which is that he sort of recognized that device simplicity can go down even as system complexity can go up, right? Now, what does he mean by that? Let's take the iPhone. You would not argue that this is like, you have to recognize that this is simpler and more elegant in some ways, more clean and inviting than a BlackBerry from 2001, let's say, right? At the same time, which of you would actually say that life was somehow easier when managed through your phone, or that this system of technology that we now have is simpler than it was just 3 years ago, right? We're in the midst of complexity going up, even while simplicity of the individual devices is going up as well. So, and another example about this. So your phone knows your computer knows your Wi-Fi, and yet your phone doesn't know Wi-Fi, right? This basic transitive logic in gadgets doesn't exist right now. We're starting to get to that point, but we don't. The point is that all of these things are essentially islands. I don't know why that's jumping around. So the point is, you've got to stop thinking about products as islands separate from each other, right? Now, how might you start doing that? This is a company, is anybody familiar with this company, Automatic? Anybody? So really interesting product, right? I mean, it's essentially tapping into your phone in your car to probably the first and maybe third most important computer, or most expensive computers you own. So you plug it into the steering wheel, and what it does is it uses GPS and accelerometer data from your phone to actually add to the driving information that you know from the car. And when you're accelerating too fast, for example, it'll just chime to tell you in a very sort of subtle and quiet way, consider your driving. It's about noting something as opposed to sort of actively engaging in it, right? Now, that's a really interesting lightweight interaction, but you know, sort of, it sounds simple enough, but actually look at what they're integrating with, right? So now Automatic actually can be tied to SMS, it can be tied to your lights, it can be tied to Google Spreadsheets, to if this then that, which is a really interesting service. The point is, this product is really thought of as a node in a network of inputs and sensors and interactions as opposed to a product in and of itself. It's an interesting idea. So Bill cashes this out and says, new devices must reduce system complexity and increase system value, right? That's a real aspiration, I think. And if you look at the successes of consumer electronics, user interfaces, the best of them have done these things in concert, right? And the products we typically find unsatisfying don't. So, goal number 2, context. this is an example, you're actually mirroring this arrangement right now. But this is a Victorian classroom from, sorry, is that my phone? I think it is. I apologize. So this is a Victorian classroom from, I think, about the mid-1800s. And what you see is actually a factory, right? The analogy here is just a factory. You have kids lined up in rows, teachers in the front like foremen. And basically this idea is that you're going to impart information and they might recite it back to you, but it's an assembly line idea about stamping knowledge into a mind and then just moving it on along along down the line. Now compare that with a really interesting piece of work that comes out of IDEO. This is for Steelcase. These are chairs that you can rearrange inside of a classroom that can configure to a lecture type format, or they can be reconfigured into these little groups to face each other, right? The point I want to raise with this is that you're actually seeing two different ideas about what education is and what values it embodies just in the products here. You know, these are very simple objects to look at. They're very simple objects to sort of understand how they work, but they embody much different philosophies about what learning is. I raise that because, you know, a friend of mine, Duncan Lamb, you know, he likes to say our devices are still in the Victorian phase. We're still in this one-way interaction where we're telling it something and maybe it repeats it back to us. We're not in a collaborative or dynamic sort of environment with the devices that are in our lives. This, of course, is the movie Her by Spike Jonze. Has anybody in the audience seen it? Hopefully, yeah. So what's interesting, this movie is about a guy who falls in love with an OS. And what's interesting is the OS is almost indistinguishable from a person. It's a person that he gets to know, whose complexity grows over time, who sort of comes to anticipate what he wants and can sort of have this sort of push-pull relationship with him just like a real human would. And so the lines at that point get very blurred, right? This is actually, I think, closer than you think. I mean, this reads as pure sci-fi, but I would point you to the example of Google Now, right now, which uses the information in your calendar and in your email and all the other services Google has to do things like predict what traffic's going to be like today and to tell you, suggest to you that you should be leaving a little bit early today, for example, because traffic is really bad. The point is that it's taken some pretty simple information that we all take for granted and put it together in a context that makes sense. It's far more useful than any one of those individual pieces of information might have been by themselves. So, the point I want to make here is that complexity decreases as context increases, right? You can get away with a lot of things if your context is right? You can make a lot of interesting and elegant solutions when you have sort of the context considered as opposed to feature sets and whatnot. UX isn't just speed, it's context. So that's the point of the second part of the second point I want to make. The last one that I'll make here is that the future isn't necessarily supernaturally smart, right? It's possible that it's also just smart enough. And here I'll just give a quick example. Actually, here, one second. I'll just start with an example of what's going on right now with UX in sort of in environmental situations. This is a example from Disney. Right now, if you go to Disney World, essentially, you don't have a ticket anymore, right? You instead get this wristband, which you can just swipe in using RFID, and you swipe into your hotel rooms, you swipe into pay, you swipe into rides. Well, what's interesting is that you can actually then do things because this has a long-range sensor in it. It's just a radio, basically, with a radius of 40 feet. That the environment can essentially sense who you are down to the individual, right? So you can do things like seeing if somebody has waited too long in a line and push them a notification that, hey, you know, I'm sorry you had to wait 40 minutes to ride Space Mountain. Would a ice cream sundae make it up to you, right? This hasn't happened yet. I mean, some of this stuff is still being designed right now and it's not public. But the point is you can actually join sensors, and this is all proven technology, right? This is simple stuff in some ways. But if you step back, this is kind of a terrifying prospect, right? I mean, when you think about people being able to recognize nuances of your experience in your life by looking at, you know, sort of with an environment that sort of anticipates what you've been doing and tracks your movement, that's Minority Report, right? That's the scary situation you get when things know more than you realize. So my point with this is that in the wrong environment, breakthrough UX is terrifying, right? There's all kinds of things that your phone can do right now that it's not doing simply because we're scared of it, right? You can actually, in Asia, the technology exists to essentially micro-target people with ads that say, like, you just left the dry cleaner, would you like to go to lunch or something like that at this place? You can do that, but the social acceptance isn't there yet. The point is there's this push and pull with consumer expectation that we're negotiating right now. So how might you deal with that? How might you create new experiences in light of that? You know, UX is approaching, I think, its own uncanny valley where we're sort of freaked out by the possibility, and not necessarily all that cognizant. You know, it's sort of smart enough to be kind of disarming, but also smart enough to be kind of horrifying. Here's a guy I know, Matt Webb, and he has actually a really interesting idea. He runs this design firm that actually just folded this week, unfortunately. He has this idea of being as smart as a puppy, right? It's not that things should be, you know, supernaturally smart. It's that they should obey. They should engage in some sort of sense of dialogue. They should ask for permission. They should admit of being taught, right? And here's just an example of how something might be as smart as a puppy. Here's actually an idea for what Google would look like as a camera app. I can see movement. Am I right? Thanks. So this is actually picking up some of the shapes around it and asking if it wants to search for something. This is a working prototype. So one thing I want to point out about this is that this is all stuff that you could have figured out algorithmically, right? A computer can certainly make a guess about any of these things. It could have known that you were indoors. It doesn't have to ask you. Instead, it's intentionally acting a little bit dumber than it actually could be in the effort of engaging you in a dialogue in which you feel some control in some idea and some, you know, some idea of what the capabilities of this thing are. It's basically teaching you what its own limitations are, right? And that's an important idea as you think about UX that uses things like AI and sensors and, you know, ubiquitous, you know, let's say mesh networks and things like that. So just to recap, the tenets that I laid out here, 1, less complexity, 2, more context, and 3, just smart enough. And that's it. Thank you for coming. So any questions from anybody?
So I was at this spin, like one of these new fitness places that just does spin classes, and the guy was talking about selling people's data to insurance companies.
Right.
And that, like, so you could get a discount from your health insurance company,
Right.
but they would track all of your health metrics, and then if
Right.
you don't go, they increase the prices.
Right.
So what do you
Right.
think about the likelihood, and is that good or bad in your mind?
I would submit to you that if you were willing to sell it, you've decided that it's fine. But one thing I will say is, like, a lot of the eeriness and the unease that we have with data out there is because there's an implied third party in the room. With Google or Facebook, you know, they're never having a very clear or clean relationship with your data. They're always sort of you're always having to assume that they're using the data for some other end, right? Now, imagine if you changed the business model a little bit. Imagine if you gave a company money to manage data, and on your behalf, they sort of went out and customized experiences for you so that you would never have a keychain or keychain password or anything like that. And this is a company like, let's say, Dropbox or somebody like that you paid to give you these experiences, unlock them and manage them, and, you know, sort of manage your privacy, right? This isn't a company that exists right now, but my point is, you might be more willing to do that than you would be willing to have Google and Facebook actually do this for you for free, right? And where I'm going with that is, as soon as you change the business model, I think you change our ideas about what kind of UX and this sort of next-gen UX will accept, because your relationship to that data, your sense of what it's being used for completely changes. So I would say, yeah, I mean, I think that data for money, but not necessarily to other parties, is probably something like what we'll see in the future. I mean, I don't know about you, but I certainly would pay $10 a month not to have to worry about credit cards or logging into computers and things like that. But we'll see. Any other questions? I approve. All right. Thank you.
So we're gonna break for refreshments now. Anyone wants to go to the reception area? We have snacks, wine, and coffee. We'll be back up here at 10 and 4.
in the organizations. And within SAP, we've created this cross-functional team of design talent, and we've created an open environment to facilitate this, as well as add a design-friendly process. So I encourage you to join me in this journey to transform the experience, the lives of the enterprise workers to be, just as easy to use as consumer products. Thank you. Any questions?
So I have a question. I'm from outside of this entire world where you guys live and work. I'm a semiconductor professional. I'm very analytical, but I'm kind of looking at, so I'm extraordinarily constantly frustrated by poor integration, poor user interface. Things don't work. They're not intuitive at all many times. So for somebody that's analytical like me, can you recommend kind of, if I was going to transition, make a career transition and move into either design space or kind of the testing space? You know, I'm not an artistic, like creative guy. I'm more kind of analytical and, wow, that's wrong, document that and stuff. Can you make any suggestions about like what area of the either the UX or the mobile app development kind of thing?
I think anyone who has the ability to have a systems thinking, we call it systems thinking, someone who can have a large problem space in mind. Because in enterprise, the challenge is you have multiple stakeholders taking a view at the same data. And in consumer products or a website, you have one user doing one task. It's pretty linear, and there's no downstream impact of that person's action on everything else that's going on. So in an enterprise, there's this dependent, like almost a matrix of stuff that's going on. So anyone who has the cognitive ability to really think in that systems way, I think that's a skill that you already have. Now, in addition to that, you need to be able to have a deep empathy for this end user to represent them and drive that design aspect. There are various ways to do that. There are, if you're interested in user experience, there are some courses. I saw Tradecraft and General Academy and others that can give you that, skill set from a user experience perspective, and given your background, it would be a great synergy. So I can speak for our team, and I have some colleagues here who can add more information. So we get to work with the customer, and I'll give you an example. We looked at an ice cream truck delivery scenario. So there's a person who's stocking ice cream, and then and all this information is coming, into a central database, right? So the managers want to look at it, the store owners, and so on and so forth. So what we do is sometimes do ride-alongs. Go with the drivers to see what do they do, what information do they collect, how do they do it. It's a lot of fun. And then you bring it all in. And what the design thinking process is the core difference between our traditional user experience and design thinking, in my opinion, is when we did user research, we would create a nice report, a 100-page report, and hand it over to the product team and say, voila, we did research, we did all this ethnographic research, and here's what we learned. And then they kind of read half of it, they get half of it, they're not sure. In design thinking, we don't do that. We bring them all into a room, so maybe a room like this, right? And we would share our findings, we would do 360 research, we would bring their stakeholders' perspective into it as well, and then we would look at the problem space, first broad, so that's called divergent thinking, and then we converge and say, what are the key problems that we can fix? Because we will uncover 100 problems, we can't fix everything, right? So we need to focus in on what are the key things we want to fix, and once we identify the problems we want to fix, then we diverge again and find solutions. We iterate, we do quick prototypes, sketches, get quick user feedback, diverge, and then we find a solution that works for us. So it's a slightly different type of user research, but I think it's more fun.
I'm kind of curious to learn more about the culture change aspect, because as you mentioned, I work in enterprise, and when you're in enterprise, like talking about user experience, usually the last thought, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, who are the people that normally come to you guys and say, we need this help? And is it normally coming to say, we want more features, and you guys come in and say, oh, by the way, you can consider this? Or are there actually people that are coming from IT or from management saying, hey, you know what, we actually want to transform how our operations work and implement user experience into it?
So remember I said there is a solid business case for good design. That is the key. So I think when I meet with senior executives or business folks, I don't try to sell design for design's sake. You don't want to preach to them, but rather try to kind of empathize with them and say, you know what, you're going to get more productivity from your call center worker. You're going to they're going to make less errors, right? If we actually go in and find out what they're doing, maybe yes, it takes that upfront time upfront to learn about exactly what they do, but they're going to make less errors. You don't need to train them. You don't need to send them for 2 weeks for training. You can put them right away because we know exactly what they're going to do. So sell it to them from a different angle.
Are you talking to people like at the COO, CFO level, or are you talking to middle managers? Like, who is it? Because normally the people who feel the pain are the people down there, right?
Yeah.
So who are you talking to?
So in our work, so SAP, I mentioned there are many different groups. So the Design and Co-Innovation Center, it's mostly a C-level request. So it will come from the top, and then we engage with the IT managers who are responsible for their enterprise systems. And then they have a team, it's usually a global organization, they have a team of people underneath them. So it goes like that. But what we do is, so that we found in our experience, the IT managers are starting to get it, right? Because they want to have that better relationship with lines of business. The resistance comes a little bit lower in the food chain. So when we do our design thinking, we make sure we engage with them as well. And so that's how it's been working. And really, it's each customer will have a certain hook that will resonate with them, and we just have to try different arguments and see what works. Great, thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the session.
Yeah.